My name is Rachel. I am 29 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for a corporate compliance firm. My parents gave my sister their entire $800,000 retirement fund because she promised her startup would make the family rich. Dad even mortgaged the house to keep her company alive. But when the FBI arrived with fraud charges, my sister pointed at our father and told the agents he was the one behind everything. Then, the agents named names. I stood in the back of the room and watched my golden child sister try to send our father to federal prison just to save her own skin. She thought she had the perfect scapegoat. What she did not know was that I had spent months quietly dismantling her entire empire, and I was the one who handed the federal government the exact blueprint to take her down. Before I tell you what happened when the FBI agents pulled out their cuffs, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to where the lie began. The deception started exactly 1 year ago during a Sunday family dinner. The air in my parents' dining room was thick with the smell of roast beef and blind adoration. My older sister Jessica and her charismatic husband Marcus had called this mandatory family meeting. Marcus is a brilliant talker. He is an African-American man with a smile that could sell ice to a blizzard and a tailored suit that screamed success. Together, they sat at the head of the table like royalty sliding a glossy pitch deck across the polished wood. They were pitching Luminatech, a healthcare data aggregator that was supposedly going to revolutionize the medical industry and make our family millions. My parents, Tom and Linda, looked at them like they had just discovered gold. I sat quietly at the end of the table sipping my water and flipping through the pages of their presentation. As a forensic accountant, my brain is wired to find the missing pieces and trace the paper trail. It took me exactly 2 minutes to realize their numbers were completely fabricated. The user acquisition metrics made absolutely no sense. They claimed to have thousands of active daily users, but their projected revenue and server costs were completely detached from reality. I set the packet down and asked a simple practical question about their operating costs and verified financials. Jessica immediately slammed her hand on the table. Her face turned bright red as she accused me of being jealous of her success, screaming that I always tried to ruin her moments. Instead of asking her to answer the question, my mother turned on me, calling me bitter and unsupportive. My father did not even look at the math I was trying to show him. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out his checkbook, and began writing a check, completely mesmerized by Marcus and Jessica and their empty promises. I warned them that giving away their life savings without an independent audit was financial suicide. My mother glared at me and told me to leave the table if I could not be happy for my sister. That was the exact moment I realized my family would rather believe a comfortable lie than an ugly truth. The deception started exactly 1 year ago, during what was supposed to be a normal Sunday family dinner. The air in my parents' suburban dining room was heavy with the smell of pot roast and blind adoration. My older sister Jessica and her charismatic husband Marcus had called this mandatory family meeting under the guise of celebrating a new milestone. Marcus is a brilliant talker. He is a tall, striking African-American man with an effortless smile that could sell ice to a blizzard and a tailored navy suit that practically screamed success. From the moment he walked into our family 3 years ago, my parents treated him like royalty. He knew exactly how to charm my mother with compliments about her cooking and how to talk golf and real estate with my father. Together, he and Jessica sat at the head of the mahogany table like a king and queen holding court. My parents, Tom and Linda, looked at them with wide eyes, practically buzzing with anticipation. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, pushing roasted potatoes around my plate, waiting for the real reason we had been summoned. I knew my sister better than anyone. Jessica never hosted a dinner unless she wanted an audience or a favor. After the plates were cleared, Marcus cleared his throat with a gentle, commanding presence. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a thick, glossy, professionally bound pitch deck. He slid it across the polished wood table with the smooth confidence of a magician about to pull off his final trick. Luminatech. He announced, his voice dipping into a serious, visionary tone. He explained it was a revolutionary healthcare data aggregator designed to streamline patient records, eliminate hospital wait times, and completely disrupt the medical tech industry. According to Marcus, they were sitting on the precipice of $1 billion valuation. They had the code, they had the connections, and they just needed a final round of bridge funding to launch their beta platform before the major venture capital firms swept in and diluted their equity. He looked right into my father's eyes and promised him that this was the ground floor. He said he and Jessica wanted to keep the wealth in the family. He leaned forward, his voice thick with manufactured emotion, and told my parents they deserved to retire on a private island, not a suburban golf course. My mother clutched her linen napkin to her chest, her eyes shining with tears of pride at her brilliant daughter and her visionary son-in-law. I opened the folder they passed down to me. The paper was heavy and expensive. As a forensic accountant, my brain is permanently wired to find the missing pieces and trace the paper trail. I do not see glossy graphics inspiring mission statements or promises of private islands. I see numbers, and more importantly, I see the spaces where the numbers are deliberately missing. My eyes scanned the executive summary and moved straight past the marketing buzzwords to the financial projections and operating costs in the back. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the gaping holes. The entire foundation of Luminatech was a financial illusion. The user acquisition metrics were a complete work of fiction. They claimed to have 10,000 active daily users in a closed beta program, but their listed server costs and customer support overhead were barely enough to sustain a local bakery website. You cannot host compliant medical data for 10,000 people on a shoestring cloud budget. Furthermore, the projected revenue growth was a straight vertical line that completely ignored the massive regulatory compliance costs associated with healthcare data. There were no audits, no verified balance sheets, and no actual proof of product. It was a dangerous fairy tale bound in expensive leather. I closed the folder and placed it gently on the table. The sharp slap of the cardboard broke the spell Marcus was weaving. I looked at my brother-in-law and asked my first question. I kept my voice perfectly calm and professional. I pointed out that their user acquisition cost was listed at $4 per user, but their marketing budget for the next 3 quarters was completely blank. I asked him how exactly they were scaling to 50,000 users by December without a marketing spend. Marcus offered a practiced, easy smile. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, explaining that they were relying on an organic viral loop within specific medical professional networks. It was a non-answer, designed to sound smart to people who did not understand business. I pushed harder. I asked him to explain their data compliance protocols. I pointed to page 12 and noted that their listed burn rate completely contradicted their projected cash flow. I told them straight out that a company handling secure medical records cannot operate on a monthly server budget of $2,000 unless the product does not actually exist. That was when the mask slipped. Jessica slammed her hand down on the dining table so hard, her wine glass rattled, spilling red wine onto the white tablecloth. Her face flushed a deep, angry crimson. She glared at me across the table, her voice trembling with a terrifying blend of genuine rage and manufactured outrage. She demanded to know why I could never just be happy for her. She yelled that I spent my entire life sitting in a gray cubicle looking at spreadsheets, and I was just bitter that she was building a massive legacy while I was stuck auditing expense reports. She accused me of trying to sabotage her success because I was secretly jealous of her marriage, her ambition, and her vision. She started crying on command, thick tears rolling down her cheeks. A manipulative trick she had perfected when we were 7 years old. Marcus immediately wrapped a protective arm around her shoulder, pulling her close, shaking his head at me, as if I had just committed an unforgivable cruelty against his vulnerable wife. My mother rose from her chair, her face contorted with fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest and told me I was a miserable, spiteful person. She said Jessica and Marcus had worked tirelessly on this business, sacrificing their sleep and their savings, and I was just trying to ruin a beautiful family moment with my petty accounting technicalities. My father stood up right behind her, his voice booming through the dining room, shaking the picture frames on the walls. He ordered me to stop interrogating his daughter immediately. He said he would not allow me to bring my toxic, cynical attitude into his home and disrespect the family. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to stay calm against the overwhelming wave of their gaslighting. I kept my voice perfectly level. I looked my father dead in the eye and told him I was not trying to ruin a dinner. I was trying to stop him from making a massive life-altering financial mistake. I told him the numbers in that pitch deck were completely unverified. I warned him that giving them money without an independent financial audit was absolute financial suicide. I begged him to look at the paperwork objectively. I told him that real technology companies do not hide their operating costs behind meaningless buzzwords and emotional manipulation. I explained that if this company were actually worth $1 billion, institutional investors would have already funded it, and Marcus would not be asking his retired father-in-law for bridge capital at a Sunday roast. My father did not listen. He never listened when it came to Jessica. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and utter disgust. He said I had no vision, no business sense, and absolutely no loyalty to this family. He told me that my forensic accounting degree did not make me smarter than Marcus, who had actual real-world entrepreneurial experience. He turned his back to me completely, reached inside his tailored jacket, and pulled out his leather-bound checkbook. He looked down at Marcus, his face softening completely, actually apologizing to him for my behavior. He told Marcus and Jessica that he and my mother believed in Luminatech, and more importantly, they believed in supporting family dreams. I sat completely frozen in my chair as I watched my father uncap his silver pen. The sick, heavy feeling of impending doom settled in my stomach. I begged him to wait. I pleaded with him to let me look at their actual corporate bank statements and tax returns before he signed his name on anything. My mother turned to me with eyes as cold as ice and told me to shut my mouth right now or get out of her house and never come back. The silence in the dining room was deafening, broken only by the sharp, terrifying scratch of my father's pen moving across the paper. He wrote out a massive sum, ripped the check from the binding, and slid it across the mahogany table to Jessica. She wiped away her fake tears, picked up the check, and looked right at me. She smiled. It was a smile of pure, victorious malice, the smile of someone who knew she had just won absolute control over our parents' lives. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out the front door into the cold night, knowing with absolute certainty that I had just watched my family buy their own destruction. 3 months passed since that disastrous Sunday dinner. I kept my distance from my family, burying myself in my casework at the corporate compliance firm. I tried desperately to convince myself that my parents had only written a small symbolic check to humor Marcus and Jessica. I wanted to believe my father, a man who had worked 40 consecutive years as a mid-level regional manager, possessed enough basic financial preservation instinct to protect his nest egg. I was painfully naive. The devastating reality of their delusion crashed down on me on a humid Tuesday afternoon in August. My mother had asked me to come over to help set up her new wireless network. She was out running errands at the grocery store, so I let myself into the house using my spare key. While waiting in my father's home office, searching the desk drawers for the router password, I noticed a stack of thick certified mail envelopes sitting open on his polished mahogany desk. As a professional auditor, I do not make a habit of snooping, but the bold red logo of my father's retirement brokerage immediately caught my eye. Right beneath it was a massive stack of loan origination documents from a prominent national bank. My stomach plummeted straight to the floor. I reached out my hands, physically trembling with a sudden surge of adrenaline, and pulled the top statement toward me. It was a final distribution summary. The balance on his retirement account, a fund that had held exactly $800,000 just 90 days prior, was completely zeroed out. He had liquidated every single penny, willingly eating the massive early withdrawal tax penalties and federal fees in the process. Beneath that devastating statement lay a finalized secondary mortgage agreement. My parents had borrowed heavily against the equity of their fully paid-off suburban home, extracting another $200,000 in raw cash, $1 million in total. They had handed Marcus and Jessica a staggering $1 million of untraceable, unregulated cash to fund a company that did not exist. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. My chest tightened so violently, I genuinely thought I was having a heart attack right there in the study. They had not just made a risky investment in a startup. They had literally set their entire future on fire to fund an absolute mirage. Just as I dropped the heavy stack of papers back onto the desk, my father walked into the room. He froze in the doorway, his eyes darting frantically from the exposed financial documents to my pale, horrified face. I did not yell. I kept my voice eerily calm, falling back on the exact same clinical tone I use when interrogating corporate embezzlers in downtown boardrooms. I asked him what he had done. He puffed out his chest, trying to project a defensive patriarchal authority, claiming it was none of my business and that he was single-handedly securing generational wealth for our entire family. I pulled my work laptop from my leather tote bag, slammed it open onto the desk, and pulled up a blank spreadsheet. I forced him to step closer and look at the screen. I typed out the numbers, rapidly breaking down the raw, undeniable math of the healthcare technology sector. I showed him that even if Lumina Tech miraculously acquired the magical 10,000 users Marcus boasted about, the basic server hosting costs, mandatory data compliance insurance, and minimal payroll would burn through $1 million in less than 6 months without generating a single cent of actual profit. I looked at my father, my voice finally cracking with genuine desperation, begging him to see reason. I told him Marcus had absolutely no background in medical data compliance. I told him Jessica had never managed a personal budget larger than her own credit card limit. I warned him that he had just handed his survival money to a pair of amateur con artists who were playing business with his life. Before my father could even process the devastating numbers on the screen, the office door flew open and slammed against the wall. My mother stood in the frame, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom. She had returned home early and heard everything from the hallway. She marched across the room, forcefully slammed my laptop shut, and pointed a shaking finger directly in my face. She did not try to defend the math. She did not try to defend the business plan. She attacked me. She told me I was a miserable, toxic wretch who could not stand to see my beautiful sister succeed. She screamed that Jessica and her charismatic husband were building an empire, and my father was a true visionary for backing them while I was nothing but a jealous, narrow-minded bean counter trying to drag them down to my own level of mediocrity. The sheer volume of her delusion was suffocating. I looked at my father silently, pleading with him to intervene, to look at the undeniable proof of his impending bankruptcy sitting right there on his desk. He looked away. He chose to stare at the floor, picking his golden child and his aggressive wife over the daughter who was desperately trying to save his life. Then my mother delivered the final crushing blow. She stepped closer, her eyes cold and empty, and told me that if I could not blindly support my sister and her husband, I was no longer a part of this family. She ordered me to leave my spare key on the desk and get out of her house forever. I stood there for a long moment, utterly shattered by the realization that my parents would rather destroy their own lives than admit I was right. I slowly unclipped the metal key from my ring, placed it on the mahogany wood, turned my back on the family that had just discarded me, and walked out into the suffocating heat of the afternoon. As I started my car engine, I looked back at the house I grew up in one last time. The curtains were already drawn shut. They had chosen their path, and I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the next time I heard from them, it would not be an apology. It would be an emergency. I drove away entirely cut off from my own bloodline, leaving them alone with the financial time bomb they had willingly strapped to their own chests. 6 months of absolute suffocating silence followed the day my mother threw me out of my childhood home. For half a year, my phone did not ring with check-in calls from my parents. There were no holiday invitations, no forwarded family photos, no apologies. I threw myself entirely into my work at the corporate compliance firm, pouring my relentless energy into untangling complex corporate fraud cases for my high-profile clients. It was significantly easier to dissect other people's financial disasters than to dwell on the one my own family had so willingly chosen. I built a quiet, heavily structured life in my downtown apartment, telling myself every single day that the estrangement was a necessary boundary for my own mental survival. But the peace I found was incredibly fragile, always shadowed by the knowing heavy dread of what was inevitably coming. You cannot burn $1 million of unregulated cash without creating smoke, and the federal government is exceptionally good at finding the fire. The inevitable detonation happened on a freezing Tuesday in February, right in the middle of a brutal tax season. It was past 11 at night. I was sitting at my kitchen island, wrapped in an oversized sweater, nursing a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea, and reviewing a dense audit file when my phone vibrated violently against the cold granite countertop. The caller ID flashed my father's name. My heart immediately hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. In my family, late-night phone calls only meant one thing: a catastrophic emergency. I stared at the glowing screen for 5 agonizing rings, fighting every logical urge in my body to let it go straight to voicemail. But the deeply conditioned reflex of a daughter who had spent her entire life trying to save her family overrode my common sense. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not even get the chance to say a simple hello. "Rachel, you have to help me." My father's voice was completely unrecognizable. It was stripped entirely of the booming, arrogant authority he had weaponized against me in his study 6 months prior. He sounded small, terrified, and breathless, exactly like a man who had just realized he was standing blindfolded on the edge of a sheer cliff. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for banishing me or choosing Jessica over me. He just started talking in frantic, disjointed, desperate sentences. He told me he was standing outside on the back porch in the freezing rain because he absolutely did not want my mother to hear him making this phone call. He begged me for off-the-record accounting advice, pleading for it to remain strictly between a father and his daughter. My forensic instincts flared immediately, pushing my personal hurt aside. I kept my voice perfectly flat and clinical, demanding to know exactly what was going on. My father took a ragged, shaking breath and confessed the devastating trap Jessica had seamlessly set for him. 3 months into the heavily publicized launch of Lumina Tech, Jessica had approached him with a stack of legal documents. She told him that to save on executive salary costs during their crucial initial growth phase, she desperately needed to list a trusted family member as the official chief financial officer on their state corporate registry and federal tax filings. She promised him it was merely a ceremonial title, just a necessary bureaucratic formality to satisfy the bank compliance officers, while she and Marcus handled all the actual capital. Blinded by pride and his unwavering foolish devotion to his golden child, my father signed his name on the dotted line without consulting a single lawyer. He legally bound himself to the financial epicenter of a company I already knew was a complete mirage. Now the bill was coming due. My father whispered that he had just received a terrifying, thick certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service. It was a formal notice of a significant high-priority discrepancy regarding unfiled payroll taxes and flagged offshore vendor payments. The sheer audacity of the manipulation made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. Jessica and Marcus had not just taken his life savings to fund their lifestyle. They had deliberately and maliciously constructed a legal firewall, using my father as the sacrificial brick. If the company went down for financial crimes, the federal government would not look at the charismatic marketing director or the visionary founder first. They would aim their federal crosshairs directly at the chief financial officer who signed the corporate tax returns. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingertips hard against my temples, feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of the situation. A sensible person would have hung up the phone. A sensible person would have told him to hire a criminal defense attorney and washed her hands of the entire toxic mess. But this was my father, the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle, now crying into a cell phone in the freezing rain because his favorite daughter had handed him a loaded gun. I took a deep, steadying breath and established a firm, non-negotiable boundary. I told him I would not fix the problem, I would not speak to Jessica, and I would not call the IRS on his behalf. But I agreed to look at the paperwork, just to tell him exactly how bad the financial damage truly was. I instructed him to scan the IRS notice and the most recent quarterly ledger and email them to me immediately. I stayed on the line listening to his shaky, panicked breaths until the notification chime rang out on my laptop. I told him I would call him back, hung up the phone, and opened the attachment. It was a single, heavily compressed PDF file containing 72 pages of raw, unfiltered transactional data. I cracked my knuckles, pulled up a fresh, blank analytical spreadsheet on my secondary monitor, and began to run the numbers. It took my professionally trained eye less than 15 minutes to realize this was not a simple clerical error or a tragic case of a struggling startup falling behind on operational payroll taxes. This was a highly sophisticated, active, and malicious financial crime. The red flags did not just wave, they practically screamed off the digital screen in bright neon colors. I started my investigation with the flagged vendor accounts. According to the ledger, Lumina Tech was paying upwards of $40,000 a month to three separate third-party server hosting and data management companies. But when I cross-referenced the employer identification numbers listed on the attached invoices with the Federal Registry database, the company simply did not exist. The identification numbers were completely fabricated, generated out of thin air to make the invoices look legitimate to a casual, untrained observer. But they were not real vendors providing actual services. They were phantom entities, carefully designed hollow shells meant to bleed cash directly out of the primary operating account. Then I moved my attention to the wire transfers. This is where the true terrifying horror of Jessica and Marcus and their operation revealed itself to me. Real corporate transactions leave a clear, auditable, and logical trail. Money moves from a business checking account to a verified corporate vendor with corresponding legally binding service agreements. But the money leaving the Lumina Tech accounts was not going to legitimate tech vendors or established healthcare compliance firms. It was being wired in massive, erratic, and highly suspicious chunks directly into limited liability companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Furthermore, I noticed a terrifying pattern. These transfers were always kept precisely just below the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic federal banking alerts. It is a classic textbook money laundering technique known in the financial world as structuring or smurfing, and it is a massive federal felony carrying severe prison time. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the harsh blue light of the laptop screen illuminating the absolute devastation in front of me. My heart pounded a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. My parents had given Jessica and Marcus $1 million of clean, legally obtained retirement and mortgage funds. The startup was never meant to build a revolutionary healthcare data platform. It was nothing but a temporary holding tank. Jessica and Marcus were systematically draining my parents' entire life savings out of Lumina Tech through fake invoices and structured wire transfers, washing the money clean through offshore shell companies for their own personal use. And because my father was the legally designated chief financial officer, every single one of those fraudulent, illegal transfers had his digital signature stamped on the authorization line. He was not just an ignorant, foolish investor who lost his retirement fund in a bad business deal. Legally speaking, the documents painted him as the primary architect of a $1 million corporate embezzlement scheme. The IRS had not just found a simple tax discrepancy to audit. They had stumbled over the tripwire of a massive federal fraud operation, and my father was standing right in the center of the blast radius holding the detonator. I realized with terrifying, undeniable clarity that I could not just give my father a piece of friendly accounting advice and walk away. He was facing decades in federal prison. I had to uncover exactly where the stolen money was going, and I had to build an airtight case, proving that Marcus and Jessica were the ones actually pulling the strings before the federal government kicked down my parents' front door. It was past 2 a.m, but the adrenaline flooding my system made sleep an absolute impossibility. I was sitting alone in my dark kitchen, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen. I had the initial fabricated wire transfers and the fake vendor identification numbers sitting right in front of me, but I needed to know exactly who was waiting at the end of that digital money trail. In the world of forensic accounting, we have a saying, the money never actually disappears, it just changes clothes. I poured myself another cup of black coffee, opened a new secure browser window, and logged into my premium public records database. I needed to pierce the corporate veil of these limited liability companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. It is incredibly easy to hide money if you know how to build a complex corporate maze, but amateur criminals always leave a digital fingerprint. They use the same registered agent, they recycle a mailing address, or they slip up on a secondary state franchise filing. I spent the next 3 hours relentlessly cross-referencing property deeds, business licenses, and tax registrations. I dug through layers of corporate obfuscation, determined to find the architect of my family's destruction. Finally, right around 4 a.m, I found the absolute undeniable connection. I uncovered a secondary incorporation document filed in a tiny county in Nevada that linked back to the primary Delaware shell company. The phantom vendors bleeding my parents dry were not anonymous offshore entities controlled by strangers in another country. They were directly managed by Marcus. My charismatic African-American brother-in-law, the man my parents worshipped as a brilliant tech visionary. The man who wore impeccably tailored suits and charmed my mother with extravagant compliments at Sunday dinner, was listed as the sole managing director of every single fake vendor account. He was not just a smooth-talking head of marketing for Lumina Tech. He was the chief architect of a massive coordinated embezzlement ring. He had specifically set up these shell companies months before that infamous Sunday dinner, perfectly positioning his digital net to catch my parents' retirement fund the exact moment it dropped. My parents had been so desperate to appear supportive and progressive, so eager to welcome this charming, successful man into the family, that they never once bothered to look past his brilliant smile. I felt a sickening mixture of rage and professional awe at the sheer audacity of his operation. I kept digging, relentlessly tracking exactly where the cash flowed after it was washed through Marcus's shell companies. It certainly did not go into healthcare software development or medical compliance algorithms. The money went straight into extreme, unadulterated luxury. I pulled up regional property records and found a massive all-cash transaction executed just 2 months after my father completely drained his 401k. Marcus and Jessica had purchased a sprawling $1.2 million penthouse condo in a highly exclusive downtown high-rise. They bought the property entirely under the name of one of the Delaware shell corporations to hide the ownership, but the utility bills and the property tax assessments were routed directly to a private mailbox registered to Marcus. My stomach churned violently as I pulled up the old real estate listing photos from the property archive. I sat there in the dark, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the imported Italian marble countertops, and the massive private rooftop terrace overlooking the city skyline. My father was currently sitting in a freezing suburban house, terrified out of his mind, facing a second mortgage he could not possibly afford to pay off, all so my sister and her husband could sip expensive champagne in a $1 million penthouse. The absolute contrast between my parents' utter financial ruin and my sister's stolen luxury made me physically nauseous. I remembered Jessica accusing me of being jealous of her success. She was not successful. She was a parasite feeding directly on the people who loved her the most. But the penthouse condo was not even the worst part of their spending spree. I traced a secondary series of massive wire transfers routed to a boutique maritime brokerage firm based in South Florida. Just weeks after purchasing the condo, they had acquired a luxury yacht. They literally named the vessel the Golden Vision. The absolute sheer arrogant audacity of it made me want to scream at the top of my lungs. They were floating on crystal clear ocean water, directly funded by my parents' 40 years of grueling hard labor, and my father had absolutely no idea. He thought he was funding a revolutionary medical startup that would change the world. Instead, he was paying for a luxury boat while he worried about how to pay his own electric bill. They were burning through the stolen cash at an astronomical rate, completely unconcerned with the devastation they were leaving behind. As the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale gray light through my apartment windows, the true horrifying terror of their scheme finally hit me. Finding the stolen money and uncovering the luxury assets was one thing, but understanding the legal liability was an entirely different and much more dangerous reality. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about family drama or broken hearts or who manipulated whom. They only care about who signed the official documents. I needed to see exactly how Jessica and Marcus had structured the corporate hierarchy on paper. I pulled up Lumina Tech's official state incorporation documents and their federal employer tax filings. I needed to know exactly who was legally responsible for the corporate accounts when the federal government inevitably came knocking. I zoomed in on the signature lines of the federal tax returns and the official corporate banking authorizations. What I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. On paper, Jessica and Marcus had completely insulated themselves from the company's financial operations. They were listed merely as minority shareholders and non-executive founders. They had zero legal fiduciary duty on paper. They did not have official signing authority on the primary operating accounts. They had deliberately constructed a brilliant legally binding firewall to protect themselves from any financial fallout. But sitting right there on the primary authorization line, designated as the sole chief financial officer and the primary fiduciary agent for Lumina Tech, was my father, Thomas. The trap they had built was a masterpiece of absolute malicious betrayal. Jessica had specifically designated our father as the chief financial officer on all legally binding state and federal documents, under the guise of saving money on executive salaries. She had convinced him it was a harmless honorary title, just a favor to help his daughter get her business off the ground. She knew our father would never hire an independent lawyer to review documents handed to him by his favorite child. But in the eyes of the federal government, there is no such thing as an honorary chief financial officer. The person who signs the tax returns and authorizes the corporate bank accounts is legally responsible for every single penny that moves through the company. Jessica had orchestrated a flawless scenario where she and Marcus reaped all the luxurious financial rewards of the fraud while legally forcing our father to hold the smoking gun. When a company engages in systematic wire fraud and tax evasion, the authorities do not go after the marketing director or the visionary founder first. They follow the signatures on the financial documents. Every single time Marcus transferred a payment to his fake offshore vendors to pay for the penthouse or the yacht, the transaction legally fell under my father's direct authorization. My father was the one legally committing wire fraud. My father was the one legally embezzling corporate funds. My father was the one committing federal tax evasion. He had blindly signed his own federal indictment just because his golden child asked him to. The realization crashed over me with the weight of a collapsing building. When the house of cards finally fell and the federal authorities came to investigate the tax discrepancy, they would not arrest Jessica or Marcus. They would arrest my father. He was looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison for crimes he did not even know he was committing. My sister, the golden child who had been handed everything her entire life, had intentionally and systematically set up our father to be the ultimate scapegoat. She was entirely willing to send the man who raised her, the man who mortgaged his own home to keep her happy, to a federal penitentiary just to protect her $1 million condo and her luxury yacht. I closed my laptop and sat in the silent morning light, completely numb. I had spent my entire life feeling like the spare child, the one who was never quite good enough for their love. They had thrown me out of their house like garbage when I refused to sacrifice my own practical logic for Jessica's delusions. But as I sat there processing the sheer magnitude of my sister's betrayal, I realized I was the only person on earth who could stop this. I could not save their money. The retirement fund was gone forever, completely converted into real estate and luxury boats that would soon be seized by the government. But I could save my father from dying in a federal penitentiary. I realized then that I could not simply call them and explain this. They would never believe me over Jessica. If I wanted to save my father from the trap my sister had built, I had to completely destroy her. And I was going to use every single forensic accounting skill I possessed to tear her empire down to the ground. I did not wait for the morning. I printed every single document I had pulled from the public registry, every offshore incorporation certificate, every wire transfer log, and every property deed linked to Marcus and Jessica. I shoved the massive stack of papers into a heavy manila folder, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to my parents' house in the pouring rain. The drive took 45 minutes, but my mind was racing so fast it felt like seconds. I rehearsed exactly what I was going to say. I was not going to be angry. I was not going to let my emotions take over. I was going to be the cold clinical professional my father desperately needed. I was going to lay the undeniable truth on his desk and show him exactly how his golden child had strapped a financial bomb to his chest. When I pulled into the familiar suburban driveway, my heart sank. Parked right in front of the garage, taking up the absolute center of the driveway, was a brand new matte black Mercedes SUV. It was Marcus and Jessica. They were here. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. A small, terrified part of me wanted to put the car in reverse and drive back to my safe, quiet apartment. But I thought about my father crying in the freezing rain just hours earlier, and I forced myself to get out of the car. I marched up the front walkway, clutching the thick folder against my chest like a shield, and let myself in through the front door. The sound of warm laughter echoed from the kitchen. I walked down the hallway and stopped in the doorway. My parents were sitting at the kitchen island drinking wine. Jessica was leaning against the marble counter, looking absolutely flawless in a cashmere sweater, while Marcus stood beside her looking perfectly polished and completely relaxed. They looked like a magazine advertisement for the perfect modern American family. The absolute sheer hypocrisy of the scene made my blood boil. I did not bother with greetings. I walked straight up to the kitchen island and slammed the heavy manila folder down on the marble with a sharp, loud crack. The laughter died instantly. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me in shocked silence. I looked directly at my father and told him I found the money. I told him I traced the phantom vendors from the IRS notice and followed the wire transfers exactly where they went. I opened the folder and spread the printed documents across the island right over their expensive wine glasses. I pointed to the incorporation papers from Delaware and Nevada, showing Marcus listed as the sole managing director of the fake hosting companies. I pulled out the property tax records for the $1 million downtown penthouse and the registration documents for the luxury yacht in South Florida. I kept my voice absolutely steady. I told my father that Lumina Tech was a massive fraud. I explained that Jessica and Marcus had systematically drained his entire $800,000 retirement fund and funneled the cash straight into their own private offshore accounts to buy boats and real estate. Then I looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the absolute worst news. I told him that because Jessica had manipulated him into signing as the official chief financial officer, the federal government would hold him entirely legally responsible for the embezzlement. He was facing 20 years in federal prison while his daughter and her husband sailed around on a yacht bought with his stolen money. For exactly 10 seconds, nobody moved. My father stared at the property deeds, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I could see the exact moment the devastating truth tried to break through his heavy denial. But before the reality could fully settle in, Jessica absolutely exploded. She did not look at the documents. She did not try to deny the existence of the penthouse or the yacht. Instead, she let out a loud dramatic sob and slammed her hands over her face. She immediately collapsed into Marcus, who wrapped his strong arms around her, glaring at me with a look of pure, calculated menace. Jessica ripped her hands away from her tear-streaked face and pointed a shaking finger right at my chest. She screamed that I was completely insane. She shrieked that I had illegally hacked into Lumina Tech's secure servers and stolen highly classified proprietary corporate data. She cried hysterically to my mother, claiming that the documents on the table were complicated venture capital asset transfers that a low-level accountant like me could not possibly understand. Marcus stepped forward, his voice smooth, deep, and dripping with legal threats. He looked at my father and smoothly explained that it was perfectly normal for tech startups to use complex corporate structures to protect their intellectual property. He boldly accused me of committing corporate espionage because I was so consumed by bitter, toxic jealousy that I wanted to destroy my own sister's hard-earned legacy. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and to my absolute horror, it worked perfectly. My mother did not even glance at the undeniable proof sitting right in front of her. She rushed around the kitchen island to wrap her arms around Jessica, cooing and comforting her golden child. Then my mother turned to me, her eyes blazing with raw, unadulterated hatred. She told me I was a deeply disturbed and vicious person. She screamed that I had lost my mind and that I was trying to frame my own sister just to satisfy my pathetic inferiority complex. I looked at my father, desperately pleading with him to look at the signatures on the LLC documents. I begged him to just read the papers, but he refused to look down. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest to defend his favorite daughter. He told me that Marcus was a brilliant businessman who understood high-level finance, and I was completely out of line for bringing my paranoid delusions into his house. Then my mother picked up her cell phone from the counter. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I did not take my stolen papers and walk out of her house that exact second, she was calling the police to have me arrested for hacking and corporate theft. She said I was a monster, and she meant it. I stood perfectly still in that warm, brightly lit kitchen, utterly surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me. I looked at Jessica, who was still pretending to cry into Marcus's expensive suit, but her eyes darted to mine. Over her husband's shoulder, she gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. She knew exactly what she had done, and she knew she had won this battle. I did not argue anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly gathered my documents, tapped the edges on the marble counter to align them, and slid them back into the manila folder. I realized in that exact moment that you cannot use logic to save people who are willingly blinded by their own illusions. Talking was completely useless. Warning them was a waste of breath. My father was going to go to federal prison for crimes he did not commit because he loved a daughter who felt absolutely nothing for him. I turned my back on them and walked out the front door into the freezing rain. I got into my car, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and locked the doors. I knew then that I could not save my parents by showing them the truth. The only way to save my father from dying in a cell was to completely and utterly destroy my sister. And I knew exactly how to do it. The drive back to my apartment was an absolute blur of freezing rain and glowing streetlights. I did not shed a single tear the entire way home. Crying was a luxury I simply could no longer afford. My parents had made their final choice. They had looked at the raw, undeniable mathematical proof of their own financial slaughter, and they had willingly chosen to embrace the butchers. They had threatened to call the police on me to have me arrested for hacking simply for trying to save my father from a federal prison sentence. As I unlocked my front door and stepped into the quiet, empty safety of my living room, the last remaining thread of my daughterly guilt completely snapped. It was instantly replaced by something much colder and far more dangerous. I felt a surge of absolute professional focus. I was a senior forensic accountant for a ruthless corporate compliance firm. I spent my days hunting down millionaire corporate ghosts who thought they were smarter than the federal banking system. Jessica and Marcus thought they had won because they managed to convince two terrified, desperate seniors to look the other way. They thought screaming about corporate espionage and playing the victims would scare me off. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. I walked straight into my home office, turned on the harsh overhead light, and booted up my triple monitor workstation. I brewed a massive pot of black coffee strong enough to wake the dead and sat down in my ergonomic chair. I was going to tear their entire fraudulent financial world apart brick by brick, and I was going to do it in absolute perfect silence. My first step was establishing the official baseline of their lies. I needed to see exactly what Lumina Tech was claiming to be on paper compared to the grand billionaire fantasy they had sold my father at that Sunday dinner. Operating entirely in secret, I logged into the federal and state corporate registry databases, using my specialized high-level compliance credentials. I pulled every single public filing associated with Lumina Tech since the day of its incorporation. The paperwork was an absolute masterclass in aggressive corporate deception. On the surface, it looked exactly like a legitimate Delaware corporation, perfectly structured for rapid venture capital investment. But the deeper I dug into the operational filings, the more the toxic rot became visible. They had filed deeply fraudulent quarterly estimates, claiming heavy research and development expenditures to justify their massive cash burn rate. They deliberately categorized the stolen money as expensive software licensing fees, advanced algorithm optimization, and overseas server expansion. It was a beautiful and highly sophisticated narrative designed to fool a casual auditor. But I knew the actual truth. There was no medical algorithm. There was no proprietary software. There was just a massive financial vacuum continuously sucking up my parents' life savings. I opened my primary forensic analysis software and began building a master timeline, matching the exact dates of my father's massive retirement withdrawals to the sudden unexplained cash spikes in Lumina Tech's primary operating accounts. The correlation was absolutely exact, down to the very minute the banks cleared the funds. Once I had the intake of the money mapped out perfectly, I had to track the outflow. This was the most critical part of my midnight audit. I pulled up the long list of phantom vendors I had discovered during my earlier review of the IRS notice. Marcus had been exceptionally clever, using generic and highly plausible-sounding names like Apex Data Solutions and Meridian Cloud Services. To a tired government tax auditor processing thousands of returns, those names looked like standard acceptable Silicon Valley operational expenses. But I was not a tired auditor. I was an angry forensic specialist with access to premium global asset tracking databases. I ran the employer identification numbers of the fake vendors through a deep web skip trace protocol, a specific tool used by corporate compliance officers to hunt down hidden offshore assets. I spent hours relentlessly cross-referencing registered legal agents, remote mailing addresses, and secondary state franchise filings. I drank cup after cup of black coffee, ignoring the burning in my eyes as the clock ticked past 2 in the morning. I was looking for the invisible thread that tied the fake companies directly back to my sister. Right around 3 in the morning, I finally broke through their carefully constructed firewall. Marcus had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He had used the exact same registered agent in Nevada for 3 completely different shell companies, and that specific agent had inadvertently linked a secondary operating agreement directly back to a private holding company. I pulled the ownership records for that holding company, and there it was in plain black and white text. The company was solely and equally owned by my charismatic brother-in-law Marcus and my sister Jessica. I had them. I had completely bypassed their corporate veil. I systematically pulled the official incorporation documents for every single offshore and domestic entity they had secretly created. I traced the massive streams of money flowing out of Lumina Tech directly into these private hidden holding tanks. It was a perfect, unbroken chain of deliberate wire fraud, but I could not stop there. To completely clear my father of any criminal liability, I had to build a massive undeniable dossier tracking every single cent of the $800,000 my parents had invested. I had to prove beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that the money never went to actual research or development, but went straight into their personal luxury assets. I opened a massive encrypted spreadsheet and began entering the transactional data line by line. I tracked the first massive wire transfer of $200,000, leaving the Lumina Tech account under the guise of an enterprise software licensing agreement. I followed that exact sum of money through the Nevada shell company and watched it land cleanly in a private wealth management account. 3 days later, that exact same amount was wired directly to a luxury title company to secure the down payment on their $1 million downtown penthouse. I documented every single step. I took high-resolution screenshots of the bank routing numbers, the digital clearing timestamps, and the filed property deeds. Then I tracked the second huge transfer. $300,000 was funneled out as a supposed data security consulting fee. I watched the digital trail as it bounced through a secured account in the Cayman Islands, completely bypassing standard domestic tax protocols before materializing in a South Florida maritime brokerage account. That specific transfer paid for their absurd luxury yacht, the one they had arrogantly named the Golden Vision. I pulled the maritime registration documents proving Jessica was the sole registered owner of the vessel. The remaining $300,000 of my parents' destroyed retirement fund was bled out in smaller, highly calculated increments. I documented dozens of structured transfers kept intentionally just below the $10,000 federal reporting limit. I traced those funds directly to their personal credit cards, paying for designer wardrobes, first-class international flights, and outrageously expensive dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. They were living the lives of tech billionaires, entirely funded by the stolen equity of my childhood home. As the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale gray light over the skyline outside my window, my dossier was complete. It was over 400 pages of irrefutable forensic evidence. I had mapped out every single fraudulent invoice, every single structured wire transfer, and every single shell company registration. More importantly, I had highlighted exactly how Jessica and Marcus had completely insulated themselves on paper while manipulating my father into signing his name on the primary operating accounts. The binder sitting on my desk was a literal blueprint of a major federal financial crime. It told the undeniable story of a charismatic con artist and a greedy golden child who systematically robbed 2 elderly people blind and set up their own father to take the fall for wire fraud and embezzlement. I printed the entire massive document, placing the pages carefully into a thick black binder. My hands were finally steady. The panicked, desperate daughter was completely gone. I rubbed my exhausted eyes and looked at the overwhelming mountain of evidence I had just compiled. I knew I could not just hand this over to the local police. This was a massive federal offense, and I needed someone who knew exactly how to wield this kind of weapon. I needed to take this completely out of my family's hands and put it directly into the hands of the federal government. I closed the binder, locked it inside my fireproof briefcase, and prepared to make the most important phone call of my entire life. I sat staring at the black binder on my desk. It contained the absolute ruin of my parents' life. But something about the numbers still bothered me. Lumina Tech had thrown a lavish launch party and purchased $1 million penthouse. Even with my parents' $800,000, the cash burn rate did not make complete sense. Marcus and Jessica were spending money much faster than they were stealing it from my father. As a forensic accountant, I know that when the math does not balance, there is always a hidden variable. I pushed my empty coffee mug aside and pulled my keyboard back toward me. My investigation was not over. I had only just scratched the surface of their deception. I remembered the glossy pitch deck Marcus had slid across my parents' mahogany dining table a year ago. It had a dedicated slide boasting about massive institutional backing. It claimed they had secured binding letters of intent from top-tier venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. But elite venture capital firms do not invest in companies that fake their server costs and use phantom offshore vendors. I needed to see their capitalization table. I needed to know exactly who else was funding this fraudulent empire. Marcus was a brilliant talker, but he was a remarkably sloppy digital administrator. During my midnight audit, I had noticed he repeatedly used the same unsecured cloud hosting service for his offshore shell companies. I ran a basic domain search on Lumina Tech's primary website. Within 20 minutes, I found an unlisted investor relations portal hidden on a secondary server. It was locked behind a generic password prompt. I thought about the sheer arrogance of my brother-in-law. I typed in the name of their new luxury yacht, followed by the current year. The screen blinked and instantly granted me full administrative access to their entire hidden financial network. I clicked on a digital folder labeled Series A Bridge Investors. What I expected to see were the names of foolish angel investors or careless tech incubators who had failed to do their due diligence. What I actually saw made my stomach violently churn all over again. The capitalization table was a sprawling spreadsheet filled with dozens of individual names. I began cross-referencing those names using public records and local databases. They were not wealthy corporate tycoons or institutional bankers. They were retired public school teachers, widowed grandmothers, and elderly military veterans. I scrolled down the list and recognized 3 of the names immediately. They were retired couples from my parents' own suburban neighborhood. They were my father's golfing buddies and my mother's close friends from her local garden club. I felt a wave of absolute physical sickness wash over me as the reality of their operation finally clicked into place. Marcus and Jessica had not just targeted my parents for their retirement fund. They had weaponized my parents' blind trust to infiltrate an entire community of vulnerable senior citizens. My charismatic brother-in-law had used his effortless charm and his tailored suits to walk into country clubs and suburban living rooms. He used my father's enthusiastic financial endorsement as powerful social proof to convince dozens of elderly people to liquidate their hard-earned pensions and hand over their life savings. It was a classic affinity fraud scheme, perfectly executed by 2 people completely devoid of human empathy or moral boundaries. They were preying on the elderly and using my family name to do it. I needed to understand exactly how Marcus had convinced these cautious, careful retirees to part with their absolute last financial safety nets. I opened a subfolder labeled Investor Prospectus Packets. Inside were dozens of digitized pitch decks tailored specifically for individual victims. Attached to every single pitch deck was a document that made my jaw physically drop. They were signed letters of intent from 3 of the most prestigious venture capital firms in the United States. The letters formally stated that these massive billion-dollar funds were absolutely committed to leading a $10 million investment round in Lumina Tech within the next 90 days. The documents explicitly promised that early bridge investors like my parents and their elderly friends would see a massive exponential return on their money the very moment the institutional capital cleared the bank. It was the ultimate financial bait designed to create a false sense of urgency and absolute security. I downloaded the letters and examined the digital signatures. They looked incredibly authentic, complete with official corporate letterheads and matching executive watermarks. But as a compliance officer, I know exactly how to check the digital metadata embedded inside portable document files. I ran the files through a basic forensic extraction tool on my secure workstation. The hidden data completely exposed the lie. The metadata clearly showed that the official letterheads had been copied directly from a public press release completely unrelated to Lumina Tech. The executive signatures had been digitally cropped and pasted using basic photo editing software registered to an email address belonging directly to Jessica. I did not just want digital proof of this forgery, I wanted absolute, undeniable human confirmation. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was just past 6 in the morning on the East Coast. I picked up my phone and called a professional contact I had at a major compliance firm in New York, who frequently dealt with one of the venture capital firms listed on the fake letters. I explained the situation vaguely and asked him to verify the investment partner whose signature was stamped on the document. My contact laughed out loud on the phone. He told me that specific investment partner had retired from the venture capital firm over 2 years ago and was currently living completely off the grid on a remote farm in Montana. The partner had absolutely zero involvement with any healthcare technology startups, and the venture capital firm itself had never even heard of a company called Lumina Tech. The entire institutional backing was a total fabrication. The sheer immense scale of the criminality unfolding on my computer screen was absolutely staggering. My sister and her husband were not just greedy relatives taking advantage of a foolish father. They were operating a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme specifically targeting the elderly. They were actively forging federal investment documents and committing massive wire fraud across multiple state lines. This was no longer a messy suburban family dispute over a mismanaged retirement fund. This was a massive federal offense, carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences that would ensure Jessica and Marcus never saw the outside of a concrete cell for decades. But the most horrifying part of this entire new discovery brought me right back to my father. Every single one of those fake venture capital letters distributed to the elderly victims had a counter-signature on the bottom line. It was my father's signature. Jessica had printed the forged documents, handed them to my father, and manipulated him into signing them in his official capacity as the chief financial officer of Lumina Tech. She had literally made him the legally binding guarantor of a massive federal fraud operation. Every single elderly victim who had lost their pension had a piece of paper legally tying my father to their stolen money. If this entire scheme collapsed naturally, the victims would file civil and criminal suits directly against the chief financial officer. My father would not just go to federal prison. He would be completely financially destroyed, sued into absolute oblivion by his own friends and neighbors. Jessica had built the perfect crime because she had built the perfect victim to take the fall. I sat alone in my silent apartment, watching the morning light slowly fill the room. The physical exhaustion in my bones was completely burned away by a cold, relentless, and absolute fury. Jessica had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to get whatever she wanted. She had always demanded to be the center of attention, the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of our parents. She had happily let my mother throw me out onto the street when I was 13 years old, just so she could have a slightly larger slice of the family pie. And now she was perfectly willing to send the very father who worshipped her to a federal penitentiary just to fund her luxury yacht and her designer clothes. I methodically printed every single forged letter of intent. I printed the metadata reports proving Jessica had personally manipulated the digital signatures. I printed the entire capitalization table highlighting the names of every single elderly victim they had systematically scammed. I carefully hole-punched the pages and added these new devastating documents to the massive black binder on my desk. The file was now over 600 pages thick. It was a perfect, airtight masterpiece of forensic accounting. It contained every single piece of ammunition the federal government would ever need to completely dismantle Lumina Tech and send the real architects of this fraud to prison forever. I had the absolute proof I needed to save my father from a life sentence. And simultaneously, I held the ultimate devastating karma to deliver to the sister who had ruined my childhood. The evidence was secured, and the trap was finally set. I secured the heavy black binder inside my leather briefcase and walked out of my apartment into the biting Seattle wind. I did not go to the local police. The local authorities were completely unequipped to handle a multi-million-dollar interstate corporate embezzlement and affinity fraud scheme. They would have taken one look at the massive stack of complex financial documents and passed it off to a low-level detective who would take 6 months just to understand the basic corporate structure. I did not have 6 months. I barely had 6 days before the federal government realized what was happening. I needed a shark. I needed someone who spoke the exact same terrifying language as the federal authorities. I drove straight to the downtown high-rise office of David Lawson. David was a ruthless former federal prosecutor who had spent 15 years putting white-collar criminals behind bars before switching to private corporate defense. He was brilliant calculating and famously devoid of sympathy. He charged $1,000 an hour, and he was worth absolutely every single penny. When I walked into his corner office, the skyline of the city stretching out behind him like a grey canvas, he did not offer me a warm smile or a cup of coffee. He pointed to the empty leather chair across his massive glass desk and told me to sit down. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional backstory. I unclasped my briefcase, pulled out the 600-page binder, and dropped it squarely in the center of his desk. The heavy thud echoed through the silent office. I told him I had a fully documented federal wire fraud and tax evasion case, and my father was currently holding the ticking bomb. David raised a single skeptical eyebrow. He opened the binder and began to read. For the first 30 minutes, the only sound in the room was the sharp, crisp turn of heavy paper and the steady drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat perfectly still, watching his eyes track across the massive spreadsheets I had built. I watched his expression shift from polite professional boredom to absolute razor-sharp focus. He examined the offshore incorporation certificates linking Marcus to the fake vendor accounts. He scrutinized the property tax records for the luxury penthouse and the maritime registration for the yacht. When he reached the section containing the fabricated venture capital letters of intent and the extracted digital metadata proving Jessica had personally forged the executive signatures, he finally stopped. He looked up from the binder, took off his reading glasses, and stared at me with a mixture of profound shock and genuine professional respect. He told me that in his entire career, handling corporate compliance and federal indictments, he had never seen a private forensic audit so ruthlessly comprehensive. He said I had handed him a fully loaded weapon capable of taking down an entire syndicate. But then the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. David leaned forward, rested his forearms on the glass desk, and delivered the absolute crushing reality of the American legal system. He confirmed every single one of my worst terrifying suspicions. He explained that the federal government operates like a machine devoid of context or human emotion. When the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation look at a corporate fraud case of this magnitude, they do not care about complex family dynamics. They do not care that my father was a gullible, trusting old man who simply wanted to support his golden child daughter. They only care about the ink on the paper. David pulled out the corporate tax returns and the bank authorization forms from the binder and spread them out on the glass. He tapped his index finger directly on my father's signature. He told me that by legally designating himself as the chief financial officer, my father had officially assumed absolute fiduciary responsibility for Lumina Tech. The moment those fraudulent wire transfers crossed state lines and international borders, the crime became federal wire fraud. Because the money was gained through deceptive investor practices using forged venture capital letters, it became massive securities fraud. And because the taxes were deliberately hidden using offshore shell companies, it became felony tax evasion. David did the federal sentencing math right in front of me. He calculated the monetary value of the stolen retirement funds and the scammed investor pensions. He factored in the highly sophisticated offshore money laundering techniques and the deliberate forgery of institutional financial documents. He also pointed out the sentence enhancements for elder abuse, since Marcus and Jessica had specifically targeted vulnerable senior citizens in my parents' suburban neighborhood. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if the federal government indicted my father today, he would be facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. My father would die in a concrete cell long before he ever saw a parole hearing. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. I pointed frantically at the binder and argued that the offshore accounts were strictly in the names of Jessica and Marcus. I argued that the metadata clearly proved Jessica forged the documents on her personal computer. I pleaded that the evidence explicitly showed who was actually spending the stolen millions on penthouses and yachts while my father was stuck paying a second mortgage. I thought the paper trail was enough to completely exonerate him. David shook his head slowly, shattering that illusion completely. He explained the terrifying legal concept of willful blindness and plausible deniability. He said that any competent defense attorney representing Marcus and Jessica would look at this exact binder and immediately flip the entire narrative upside down. They would argue in front of a federal judge that my father was a rogue, greedy executive who embezzled the money himself. They would claim that my father completely manipulated his naive young daughter and her supportive husband, secretly setting up those offshore accounts in their names to hide his own stolen cash. Because my father's signature was the only one on the official operating accounts, he was the only one legally authorized to move the money. The defense would paint Jessica and Marcus as the innocent, unsuspecting victims of a corrupt and ruthless father. And without direct, undeniable proof to the contrary, a federal jury would absolutely believe them. The paper trail proved the money was stolen, but it did not definitively prove who was emotionally and physically pulling the strings. The walls of the corner office felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. I asked David exactly what we needed to do to save my father and ensure Jessica and Marcus took the fall. David closed the massive binder and gave me a look of absolute chilling seriousness. He said we needed a smoking gun. We needed irrefutable, undeniable proof of intent and control. The financial trace I had built was perfect, but we needed to prove beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that my father was nothing more than a manipulated puppet. We had to capture Marcus and Jessica actively acknowledging their complete control over the corporate finances and their deliberate intent to defraud the investors. David told me that the federal authorities would never grant my father immunity based purely on an external spreadsheet. We had to hand the federal government the actual perpetrators on a silver platter with a recorded confession of their total control. I sat back in the leather chair, my mind racing through the terrifying implications of what David was demanding. I had spent 15 years building a massive protective wall between myself and the toxic family that had completely discarded me when I was 13 years old. I had just driven away from their house, leaving my spare key on the counter, swearing to myself I would never speak to them again. But David was telling me that the only way to save my father from dying in prison was to get back inside that house. I had to get dangerously close to the very people who had destroyed my childhood and were actively destroying my parents' lives. I had to bypass Jessica's highly tuned manipulative radar and Marcus's smooth calculating charm. I had to trick two masterful con artists into handing me the literal keys to their own prison cells. I looked at the black binder resting on the glass desk. It represented countless hours of midnight auditing, tracing phantom vendors, and unmasking offshore shell companies. I had already done the impossible by completely dismantling their digital empire. Now I had to systematically dismantle their psychological one. I looked back at David. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not show an ounce of fear or hesitation. I told him to draft the federal immunity agreement for my father and prepare the formal evidentiary submission for the white-collar crime division. I promised him I would get the exact smoking gun he needed to lock them away forever. I stood up, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out of the corner office into the pouring rain. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had to swallow my pride, put on a flawless mask, and walk straight back into the lion's den. I was going to pretend to be the broken, apologetic sister, begging for her family's forgiveness, and then I was going to burn their entire operation completely to the ground. I sat in the driver's seat of my car for nearly an hour staring at my cell phone. The rain beat a relentless rhythm against the windshield, mirroring the frantic pounding of my own heart. I was about to do the hardest thing I had ever done in my entire life. I was about to surrender. David, the ruthless former federal prosecutor, had made the reality brutally clear. My massive binder of forensic evidence was useless without direct, undeniable proof of intent. If I wanted to save my father from a 20-year federal prison sentence, I had to provide the authorities with a smoking gun. I needed Marcus and Jessica to explicitly admit that my father was nothing more than a manipulated figurehead and that they possessed absolute physical control over the stolen funds. To get that confession, I had to drop my defenses, abandon my pride, and become the very thing I despised. I had to become a liar. I took a deep, shuddering breath, closed my eyes, and dialed my mother's number. When she answered, her voice was as cold and sharp as cracked ice. I forced my vocal cords to tremble. I manufactured a breathless sob and told her I was completely wrong. I pleaded for her forgiveness, claiming that my audit was flawed, and my toxic jealousy over Jessica's massive success had completely blinded me to the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother did not offer warmth or comfort. She simply stated that she always knew my bitter inferiority complex would ruin my life, but she would graciously allow me to come to the house and apologize to my sister in person. Walking through the front door of my childhood home felt like stepping directly into a hostile foreign country. Jessica was lounging on the velvet living room sofa, sipping sparkling water with the smug satisfaction of a queen greeting a disgraced peasant. Marcus stood behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders, radiating pure, arrogant triumph. My father hovered in the background, looking incredibly relieved that his fractured family was finally falling back into line so he could stop worrying about the tension. I swallowed every single ounce of my self-respect and looked my sister directly in the eyes. I delivered the performance of an absolute lifetime. I apologized for my insane accusations. I told her she was a brilliant entrepreneur and I was just a narrow-minded accountant who could not handle being left behind in her shadow. Jessica absolutely reveled in my manufactured misery. Her smile was sharp, predatory, and entirely devoid of empathy. She patted my hand with condescending pity and told me it was perfectly normal for ordinary people to be terrified by true visionary wealth. To completely cement her victory over me, she did exactly what I was desperately counting on. Con artists cannot simply win, they have to parade their victory. Jessica invited me to an exclusive Lumina Tech investor dinner the following evening at the most expensive steakhouse in the downtown district. She told me to come and observe how real high-level venture capital worked. I smiled gratefully, thanking her for the generous opportunity, while my mind coldly locked onto the target. I spent the next 24 hours methodically preparing my trap. I visited a specialized surveillance electronics store and purchased a high-definition concealed audio recorder perfectly disguised as a heavy black fountain pen. I spent hours in my apartment practicing clicking the top mechanism to activate the hidden microphone, ensuring the tiny recording light was completely obscured from view. I analyzed Marcus's psychological profile, knowing his monumental ego was his ultimate fatal flaw. Narcissists absolutely crave recognition for their brilliance, especially from those they deem intellectually inferior. If I played the naive, impressed sister, he would not be able to resist bragging about his criminal masterpiece. The next evening, I arrived at the luxury steakhouse wearing a simple silk blouse with the recording pen securely clipped to my collar. The private mahogany-paneled dining room smelled of expensive aged beef and $200 bottles of wine completely paid for by stolen pensions. The sheer audacity of the scene made my stomach physically churn. Sitting around the massive table alongside my parents and the golden couple were 8 elderly retirees from my father's country club. These were the victims. I activated the hidden microphone and took my seat, silently documenting the horror unfolding in front of me. For the first 2 hours, I played my role to absolute perfection. I sat quietly nodding along as Marcus stood at the head of the table, delivering a masterful, charismatic presentation. He smoothly promised these vulnerable seniors a massive exponential return on their life savings, referencing the forged venture capital letters of intent with terrifying ease. He spoke about advanced healthcare algorithms and massive institutional backing, weaving a beautiful, flawless web of complete financial fiction. I watched Jessica smile and gently touch the arm of a widowed grandmother, assuring the elderly woman that her retirement funds were entirely secure. My father sat near the center of the table, beaming with absolute pride at his successful son-in-law, completely oblivious to the fact that he was serving as the primary legal decoy for a multi-million-dollar federal crime. The elderly investors clapped and raised their wine glasses, totally captivated by the illusion. As the dessert plates were cleared and the seniors began talking amongst themselves, I knew it was time to strike. I walked over to the private corner bar where Marcus and Jessica were pouring themselves another round of vintage scotch. I slipped into a posture of complete submissive awe. I looked at Marcus, widening my eyes, acting genuinely bewildered by his financial prowess. I told him I was incredibly impressed by the sheer scale of the operation, but I admitted I was totally confused by the logistical mechanics. I lowered my voice, leaning in close to make it sound like a deeply intimate professional compliment. I told him I knew my father was the chief financial officer on paper, but my dad could barely navigate his own basic tax returns, let alone manage complex offshore vendor payments and international venture capital transfers. I asked Marcus how he possibly prevented my father from accidentally ruining the entire corporate financial structure. It was the perfect bait. Marcus laughed a loud, booming sound that echoed his absolute arrogance. He took a sip of his expensive scotch, looked at me with deep condescension, and leaned straight into my trap. Marcus puffed out his chest, his massive ego completely overriding his basic survival instincts. He explicitly stated that my father was nothing more than a convenient legal rubber stamp, an ignorant figurehead placed on the documents strictly to satisfy the state registry. Jessica chimed, in her voice dripping with cruel amusement, bragging that our father did not even possess the security passwords to the primary corporate banking accounts. Marcus aggressively took over the explanation, needing to claim full credit for the masterpiece. He boasted that he and Jessica were the only individuals holding the digital encrypted authorization tokens for the overseas wire transfers. He explicitly detailed how they deliberately routed the operational cash through private holding companies in Nevada and the Cayman Islands to completely bypass domestic banking regulations. I pushed him gently forward, masking my deadly interrogation as pure, innocent curiosity. I mentioned the specific vendor accounts I had uncovered during my midnight audit, specifically naming Apex Data Solutions. Marcus smirked and boldly admitted that Apex was simply a hollow shell entity he had personally created to funnel the bridge round capital directly into his private real estate trust. He literally bragged into the hidden microphone about using the elderly investors' money to purchase their $1 million penthouse and their luxury yacht, laughing about how effortlessly the gullible old fools handed over their life savings. He explicitly and undeniably confirmed that my father signed the federal tax returns completely blind, while Marcus and Jessica fully orchestrated and executed every single fraudulent financial transaction. The black fountain pen clipped to my collar captured every single devastating syllable in crystal clear, high-definition audio. In less than 10 minutes, they had willingly confessed to massive federal wire fraud, offshore money laundering, systematic elder abuse, and the deliberate, malicious legal framing of an innocent corporate officer. I stood there smiling politely, nodding along as they detailed the exact mechanics of their criminal syndicate. I thanked them for taking the time to explain it to me, telling them I finally understood exactly how brilliant and untouchable their operation truly was. Jessica gave me a patronizing pat on the shoulder, telling me not to feel too badly about being outsmarted by superior talent. I walked away from the mahogany bar, leaving them to finish their stolen vintage scotch. My heart was completely steady, and my mind was absolute ice. The mask had worked flawlessly. I had the smoking gun. I possessed the absolute undeniable recorded proof that would send my sister and her husband to a federal penitentiary for decades while clearing my father's name entirely. The time for apologies, family dinners, and suburban illusions was completely over. I walked out of the steakhouse into the cool night air, ready to hand the federal government the match that would burn Lumina Tech straight to the ground. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat at my kitchen table, watching the tiny black fountain pen resting on the cold granite countertop. That small piece of plastic and metal held the absolute destruction of my sister's perfectly curated life. It held the raw, undeniable confession of a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud and systemic elder abuse. As the early morning light began to creep through my apartment windows, painting the city skyline in shades of cold gray, I picked up my phone and called David. I told the ruthless former prosecutor that I had exactly what he asked for. I had the smoking gun. David did not waste a single breath on congratulations. He simply told me to meet him at the federal building downtown in exactly 2 hours and to bring every single piece of paper I had printed. I showered, put on my sharpest charcoal suit, and locked the massive 600-page binder inside my heavy leather briefcase. The briefcase felt incredibly dense in my hands. It was not just the physical weight of the paper. It was the crushing emotional weight of 40 years of my parents' blind favoritism finally coming to an agonizing, definitive end. I drove through the heavy morning traffic, my mind completely clear of any hesitation or lingering guilt. Jessica had made her choice when she decided to frame our father and steal from innocent elderly pensioners. Now, I was making mine. The federal building was an imposing, brutalist structure of grey concrete and reinforced glass. It felt completely devoid of warmth or human empathy, which was exactly the environment I needed. I walked through the heavy metal detectors, my heels clicking sharply against the polished granite lobby floors. David was already waiting for me near the secure elevators. He looked incredibly sharp, wearing an immaculate tailored suit, his eyes scanning the busy lobby with the predatory focus of a man who absolutely lived for high-stakes legal warfare. He gave me a single brief nod, and we rode the elevator up to the white-collar crime division in total, absolute silence. We were quickly ushered into a stark, windowless conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. The walls were completely bare, and the table was made of cheap, scratched laminate. It was a room designed specifically to strip away corporate arrogance and reduce wealthy executives to terrified, sweating suspects. We waited for exactly 12 minutes before the heavy door swung open. 2 federal agents walked into the room carrying plain yellow legal pads. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Miller. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and tired eyes that looked like they had seen every possible variation of human greed and financial devastation. His partner, Agent Davis, sat down beside him, maintaining a completely neutral expression. Agent Miller looked at David and then looked at me with a weary, slightly dismissive attitude. He stated plainly that his division handled massive corporate syndicates and international money laundering rings, and he sincerely hoped we were not wasting valuable federal resources on a petty suburban family business dispute. David did not flinch. He leaned forward, placed his hands flat on the cheap laminate table, and completely took control of the room. He told Agent Miller in a voice entirely devoid of emotion that we were sitting on a fully documented multi-million-dollar affinity fraud operation involving forged venture capital documents, offshore shell companies, and the systematic financial exploitation of senior citizens. Agent Miller stopped tapping his pen. His posture shifted, immediately transitioning from weary skepticism to absolute razor-sharp attention. But before Agent Miller could ask a single probing question, David raised his hand. He stated clearly and aggressively that we would not hand over a single shred of evidence until we secured a formal non-prosecution agreement and absolute blanket federal immunity for my father. David explicitly explained the trap. He told the agents that my father was the legally designated chief financial officer on state and federal paper, but he was nothing more than an ignorant, manipulated puppet used as a human shield by the actual architects of the crime. Agent Miller frowned heavily, his professional instincts kicking into overdrive. He stated that the federal government does not simply hand out blanket immunity agreements blindly, especially to the primary signing officer of a deeply fraudulent corporation. He demanded to see the evidence in the briefcase first. David smiled a cold, ruthless smile and flatly refused. He told the federal agents that the evidence inside my briefcase was a perfectly wrapped gift that would guarantee them career-defining convictions. But if they did not grant my father total immunity, we would walk right out the door and let the fraudulent company collapse completely on its own, leaving the government to clean up the messy pieces. The tension in the windowless room became absolutely suffocating. Agent Miller looked at me directly, trying to read my silence and gauge my level of actual resolve. I held his intense gaze perfectly steady, channeling every single ounce of my corporate forensic training. I told him quietly but firmly that my sister and her charismatic husband were currently draining hundreds of thousands of dollars a week from vulnerable elderly pensioners to buy luxury yachts and downtown penthouses. I warned him that they were highly flight risks who would quickly move the assets offshore the moment the cash dried up. I told the agent I had the exact offshore routing numbers, the fraudulent property deeds, the fake identification numbers, and a crystal-clear audio confession of their entire criminal intent. Agent Miller stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked at his partner, then looked back at David. He stood up abruptly, excused himself from the room, and went down the hall to make a direct phone call to the United States Attorney. We sat in silence for 20 agonizing minutes. My hands were shaking slightly beneath the table, but I kept my face frozen in an expression of absolute calm resolve. When Agent Miller finally returned, he was holding a single sheet of official government paper. It was a formal proffer agreement, signed by the federal prosecutor, granting my father complete immunity from prosecution in exchange for his full cooperation and the immediate surrender of all our collected evidence. David reviewed the document meticulously, checking every single legal clause and stipulation before giving me a short, decisive nod. I reached down, unclasped the heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase, and pulled out the massive 600-page black binder. I placed it squarely in the center of the table and pushed it toward the federal agents. Agent Miller opened the cover and began to read. I watched his tired eyes widen rapidly as he flipped through the meticulously organized color-coded tabs. I had arranged the entire complex fraud into a flawless chronological narrative that left absolutely no room for interpretation. I started the presentation with the intake of the stolen money. I pointed directly to the highlighted bank statements showing the exact liquidation of my parents' retirement funds and the targeted pension transfers from their elderly neighbors. Then I walked the stunned agents through the forged venture capital letters. I showed them the extracted digital metadata that conclusively proved Jessica had personally copied and pasted the institutional executive signatures using her own registered computer software. Agent Davis let out a sharp gasp when she saw the undeniable digital fingerprints, proving the massive scale of the intentional forgery. I did not stop there. I guided them through the incredibly complex web of offshore shell companies registered in Nevada, Delaware, and the Cayman Islands. I showed them the exact structured wire transfers specifically and maliciously designed to evade federal banking alerts. I laid out the official property deeds for the million-dollar downtown penthouse and the maritime registration for the luxury yacht, perfectly matching the stolen investment funds to their lavish personal assets. I highlighted the exact dates, showing how they bought luxury goods the very same week they drained a widowed grandmother's life savings. I had done the grueling work of an entire team of federal forensic auditors in just 48 hours, and I handed the absolute destruction of my sister's empire to the authorities on a silver platter. Agent Miller looked up from the thick binder, his face completely pale with shock and genuine professional awe. He asked me how a single person possibly managed to piece together such a massive complex corporate syndicate completely on their own without triggering a single internal alarm. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was a senior compliance auditor for a major corporate firm, and my sister made the incredibly foolish, arrogant mistake of thinking I was just a bitter, jealous sibling. But I knew the paper trail alone was still vulnerable to expensive defense lawyers. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy black fountain pen. I placed it on the laminate table right next to the binder. I told the agents that complex paper trails can be debated endlessly in a federal courtroom, but sheer human arrogance cannot be denied. I pressed the tiny hidden button on the top of the pen. The crystal clear, high-definition audio immediately filled the sterile conference room. Marcus's deep, booming voice echoed off the bare walls, bragging loudly and aggressively about how he deliberately set up the fake vendor accounts to funnel the innocent investors' cash directly into his private real estate trust. He explicitly detailed how he used my father as a blind, convenient legal shield, entirely insulating himself and Jessica from any future financial liability or prison time. Then Jessica's voice chimed in, completely dripping with cruel, condescending amusement. She laughed out loud about how incredibly easy it was to trick the gullible old fools out of their life savings. She openly mocked our father for blindly signing the federal tax returns without ever reading them, calling him a pathetic, useful idiot. The sheer raw malice and remorseless greed in her recorded voice was absolutely chilling. It was not just a legal confession. It was a masterpiece of pure malicious intent, captured forever in digital audio. Agent Miller reached out and stopped the recording. The silence in the room was absolute and profoundly heavy. He looked at me, his expression completely transformed from weary skepticism to deep, undeniable respect. He told me that they had been investigating similar affinity fraud rings for years, but they had never once been handed a case this perfectly structured and irrefutably proven. He formally accepted the evidence, taking custody of the binder and the recording device, and confirmed that a full-scale federal investigation was immediately open. He assured me that tactical field agents would begin freezing the offshore accounts and drafting the arrest warrants before the end of the day. As David and I walked out of the federal building and back into the cold Seattle rain, I did not feel a grand swelling sense of triumphant victory. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I had successfully secured my father's freedom, and I had completely guaranteed my sister's absolute destruction. The ruthless federal machine was now entirely in motion, and there was absolutely nothing Jessica or Marcus could do to stop the devastating storm that was about to violently tear their stolen luxury world apart. The keys to their fraudulent empire were gone forever, and justice was finally coming. 2 incredibly long, agonizing weeks passed since I walked out of that windowless federal conference room and left the massive black binder in the hands of the authorities. 14 days of waking up every single morning with my heart hammering against my ribs, wondering if today was the day the entire world would finally shatter. In the world of high-stakes federal investigations, silence is always the heaviest weapon. The authorities do not send warning letters. They do not call to announce their arrival. They build their absolute ironclad cases in the dark, meticulously gathering every single piece of undeniable proof until the net is pulled completely tight. I went back to my quiet, burned apartment and returned to my demanding job at the corporate compliance firm. I put my head down and buried myself in my legitimate casework. To anyone looking at me from the outside, I was just an ordinary woman living a quiet, predictable routine. My parents and my sister absolutely thought I had retreated in total defeat. They genuinely believed their vicious threats of police involvement and their loud, aggressive arrogance in that kitchen had successfully intimidated me into absolute submission. They thought they had won the war. They had absolutely no idea. They were just dancing blindly on top of a highly volatile, active landmine. While I spent those 2 weeks quietly drinking cheap coffee at my desk and reviewing legitimate corporate tax returns, Jessica decided to broadcast her absolute victory to the entire world. The sheer volume of her delusion was actually terrifying to witness. She treated her social media accounts like a daily digital reality show, aggressively flaunting the massive, staggering wealth she had systematically stolen from our parents and their elderly neighbors. My phone would silently light up in the middle of my workday with brand new notifications. I watched her live out a completely fabricated billionaire fantasy, completely unbothered by the trail of financial devastation she had engineered. Her first post of the week was a sprawling panoramic video taken from the massive wrap-around balcony of the $1 million downtown penthouse. She was wearing a silk designer robe, holding a crystal glass of expensive imported champagne and smiling perfectly into the camera lens. The caption underneath the video was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. It read that true visionary success requires cutting out all the toxic negative energy holding you back. She explicitly added a hashtag about leaving narrow-minded people behind. She was directly talking to me. She was publicly celebrating the fact that she had successfully manipulated our parents into throwing me out of their lives for a second time. I sat at my modest office desk, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, completely mesmerized by her absolute lack of human empathy. I zoomed in on the background of the video and saw the expensive modern art hanging on the walls and the custom Italian leather furniture filling the massive living space. I knew the exact offshore shell company that had wired the stolen funds to purchase every single item in that room. I knew the exact elderly pensioner who was currently struggling to pay for their prescription medications because my sister needed a luxury sofa. 3 days later, she escalated her digital performance. She posted a massive album of high-resolution professional photographs from the marina in South Florida. It was a lavish catered christening party for their new luxury yacht, the Golden Vision. Marcus was standing on the pristine white deck, wearing an immaculate linen suit, looking every inch the wealthy tech mogul he desperately pretended to be. He had his arm wrapped tightly around Jessica, who was wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than my entire annual salary. But the photograph that made my stomach physically violently turn was the 4th picture in the album. It was a picture of my parents. My father was standing on the deck of the yacht holding a glass of champagne, looking incredibly proud and entirely oblivious. He was smiling so brightly at his golden child, completely unaware that the very boat he was standing on was purchased with a fraudulent wire transfer bearing his own legal signature. He was literally celebrating on the deck of his own federal indictment. Jessica tagged me directly in a comment underneath that specific photo. She typed out a message dripping with pure dripping condescension. She wrote that it was such a shame I chose to live such a boring traditional 9 to 5 corporate life because I was missing out on the absolute magic of building true generational wealth. She told the public internet that some people are simply meant to be worker bees, while others are destined to be visionaries. She ended the comment with a bright yellow smiling emoji. The profound level of psychological discipline it took for me to simply lock my phone screen and not reply was absolutely staggering. A massive, overwhelming part of me wanted to type furiously in the comment section. I wanted to scream at her and tell the whole world that she was a pathetic con artist stealing from grandmothers. I wanted to call my father and beg him to jump off that boat and run for his absolute life. But I remembered the cold, clear advice of David, the ruthless former federal prosecutor. I remembered the heavy silence of the federal agents in that windowless room. When you hold the ultimate winning hand, you do not need to show your cards early. You just let the other players push all their stolen chips into the center of the table. So I did absolutely nothing. I did not reply. I did not block her. I just sat at my desk, sipped my black coffee, and watched her build the evidence against herself. Every single photograph she posted was another nail in her own coffin. The federal authorities were monitoring her accounts exactly the same way I was. When she posted a picture of her new diamond necklace, the FBI financial analysts were silently tracking the corresponding wire transfer from the Nevada shell company to the luxury jeweler. When Marcus posted a video boasting about his new imported sports car, the federal agents were adding the vehicle identification number to the massive asset seizure list. They were documenting every single luxury purchase, preparing to completely strip them of everything they owned the second the hammer finally dropped. During those 14 agonizing days, David called me exactly 3 times on a highly secure encrypted line. His updates were incredibly brief, completely devoid of emotion, and absolutely terrifying in their efficiency. The federal machine was moving with devastating silent speed. On day 5, David called to tell me that the federal grand jury had officially reviewed my forensic binder and immediately issued completely sealed subpoenas for all of the domestic and offshore bank accounts. On day 9, he called to confirm that the federal authorities had quietly frozen the primary operating accounts for Luminatech. They did it so subtly that Marcus and Jessica would not even realize the money was locked until they tried to execute their next massive wire transfer. On day 12, David called to deliver the final piece of the puzzle. He told me that the United States attorney had formally signed the federal proffer agreement, granting my father absolute blanket immunity from prosecution. My father was completely legally safe. He would lose every single penny he had foolishly invested, but he would not spend a single day in a federal penitentiary. Then David gave me the exact piece of information I had been waiting for since the night I stood in the freezing rain outside my parents' house. He told me that a federal judge had officially signed the master arrest warrants and the comprehensive search and seizure orders. The federal authorities were not going to simply send a polite letter in the mail. They were classifying Marcus and Jessica as extreme high-level flight risks due to their offshore banking connections and their access to liquid capital. The operation was going to be massive, coordinated, and absolutely devastating. David gave me the exact date and the exact hour the tactical teams would execute the warrants. It was a Thursday morning. I woke up precisely at 5 in the morning, long before my alarm was scheduled to ring. The sky outside my window was a deep, bruised purple, completely obscured by a heavy, thick layer of classic Pacific Northwest rain clouds. The rain beat a steady, rhythmic drumming sound against my bedroom window. I did not feel anxious. I did not feel any lingering guilt or sadness regarding my family. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of absolute, profound clarity. I got out of bed, walked into my kitchen, and began my ordinary, boring 9 to 5 morning routine. I ground the coffee beans, enjoying the rich, dark smell filling the quiet apartment. I toasted a plain bagel and buttered it carefully. I put on my standard charcoal gray corporate suit, ensuring my blouse was perfectly pressed and my shoes were polished. I was the very definition of the boring worker bee my sister loved to mock so publicly. I arrived at my office right at 8 in the morning. The corporate compliance floor was quiet, with only a few early rising accountants shuffling papers and murmuring quietly in the break room. I walked into my private office, closed the heavy glass door, and sat down at my desk. I placed my steaming mug of black coffee right next to my keyboard. I logged into my secure workstation and opened a blank spreadsheet simply because I needed something to look at. But my eyes were entirely locked on the digital clock resting in the bottom right corner of my computer screen. The warrants were scheduled to be executed simultaneously at exactly 9 in the morning across 3 separate locations. The federal agents were going to hit the fake Lumina Tech corporate office, the $1 million downtown penthouse, and the South Florida marina where the luxury yacht was currently docked. They were going to completely surround my sister and her husband, cutting off every single avenue of escape in a perfectly synchronized tactical strike. It was 8:45 in the morning. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. I imagined Jessica sleeping in her custom-imported Italian leather bed, completely unaware that a team of heavily armed federal agents was currently staging in the plush-carpeted hallway right outside her penthouse door. I imagined Marcus waking up to the sound of heavy tactical boots echoing through his fake corporate headquarters. They had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable garbage. My mother had thrown me away like an old broken toy simply because I refused to play along with the delusion. Jessica had tried to legally frame our father to protect her designer wardrobe and her stolen millions. They honestly believed they were untouchable because they had never once faced a consequence they could not lie or manipulate their way out of. It was 8:55 in the morning. The office around me began to wake up. I could hear phones ringing down the hall and the soft hum of the printer firing up in the copy room. The world was moving forward exactly as it always did, completely indifferent to the massive devastation about to occur. I placed my hands flat on my desk, taking a deep, slow breath. The sheer immense weight of the secret I was holding felt like electricity humming through my veins. I was the architect of their absolute destruction, and I was sitting hundreds of miles away, perfectly safe, perfectly calm, and entirely protected by the boring, honest life I had built for myself. The digital numbers on my computer screen shifted. It was 8:59 in the morning. I thought about my father standing on the deck of that yacht looking so proud. I thought about the text message my mother had sent, threatening to have me arrested for trying to save them. I thought about Jessica smirking at me in the kitchen, fully believing she had outsmarted everyone in the room. They had built a massive towering castle entirely out of stolen cards, and they had arrogantly handed me the final match. The clock struck exactly 9 in the morning. I raised my coffee mug to the empty room, taking a long, deeply satisfying sip. The storm was no longer approaching. It had officially arrived. The Grand Astor Hotel ballroom was a monument to obscene, unearned wealth. It was exactly the kind of venue you would choose if you were desperately trying to convince the world that you were a legitimate tech billionaire rather than a common thief. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the room. There were massive ice sculptures carved into the shape of the Lumina Tech logo, slowly melting onto silver platters. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne that cost more than my first car. The entire room smelled of expensive perfume, roasted filet mignon, and the intoxicating aroma of absolute delusion. I stood perfectly still, in the very back of the ballroom, pressed into the deep shadows near the heavy mahogany service doors. I wore the exact same simple charcoal gray suit I wore to the office every single day. I held a glass of club soda with a lime wedge, letting the condensation drip down my fingers. I was a ghost in this room of glittering thieves. Lumina Tech was officially hosting its Series B launch party. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of their fraudulent empire, the night they officially announced their massive fake venture capital backing to the world. I scanned the crowded room and felt a familiar, sickening twist in my stomach. Interspersed among the hired local influencers and the paid corporate actors were the actual victims. I recognized the retired public school teachers and the widowed grandmothers from my parents' suburban neighborhood. They were wearing their Sunday best, completely dazzled by the flashing lights and the free alcohol. They were smiling and chatting excitedly, totally unaware that they were standing in a room entirely paid for by their stolen pensions. I looked toward the front of the room and saw my parents. My father was wearing a brand new custom-tailored tuxedo, looking incredibly proud and entirely foolish. My mother was clinging to his arm, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction as she bragged to anyone who would listen about her brilliant visionary daughter. They thought they had finally arrived at the absolute pinnacle of high society. They had absolutely no idea that in less than 10 minutes, their entire universe was going to violently collapse. The ballroom lights suddenly dimmed. A sharp, dramatic bass drop echoed through the massive surround sound speakers, perfectly choreographed to grab every single ounce of attention in the room. A brilliant, blinding white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the grand stage. The crowd fell completely silent. Jessica walked out from behind the velvet curtains, and the room erupted into thunderous, rehearsed applause. She looked absolutely radiant. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green silk gown that clung to her perfectly engineered figure. Her hair was styled in flawless cascading waves, and a diamond necklace glittered aggressively under the harsh stage lights. I recognized that necklace. I had tracked the exact offshore wire transfer that paid for it just 3 weeks ago. She walked to the center of the stage, holding a sleek wireless microphone, drinking in the applause like a person dying of thirst. She held up her free hand, waving graciously, offering a completely manufactured smile of humble gratitude. Marcus stood directly below the stage, looking up at her with an expression of pure, arrogant triumph. Jessica tapped the microphone and began to speak. Her voice echoed through the massive ballroom, dripping with absolute condescending arrogance. She thanked everyone for coming to witness the dawn of a new era in healthcare technology. She smoothly and effortlessly launched into her rehearsed pitch, completely devoid of a single technical fact, but absolutely loaded with meaningless corporate buzzwords. She talked about disrupting the paradigm and revolutionizing the algorithmic data space. She looked directly at the tables where the elderly investors were sitting and promised them that their belief in her vision was about to be rewarded with generational wealth. She actually had the sheer sociopathic audacity to place her hand over her heart and thank our father for his unwavering financial guidance, calling him the brilliant chief financial officer who made all of this possible. My father beamed with pride, raising his champagne glass to the stage. I checked the plain silver watch on my left wrist. It was exactly 8:14 in the evening. I took a slow, calm breath. I knew exactly where the tactical teams were. I knew they had already secured the loading docks. I knew they were currently sweeping the underground parking garage. I knew they were stepping silently off the service elevators right into the main hallway. Jessica raised her glass high into the air, preparing to deliver her final triumphant toast. She took a deep, dramatic breath and began to proclaim that Luminatech was no longer just a company, but an unstoppable global movement. She told the crowd that nobody could ever stand in the way of true visionary genius. She never finished the sentence. The heavy, solid oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom did not just open. They were violently, completely blown backward with a deafening, echoing crash. The sheer explosive force of the breach instantly silenced the entire room. The grand symphonic music was brutally cut off by a technician in the back, leaving a shocking ringing silence in its wake. More than 30 federal agents completely flooded into the ballroom. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision. They wore dark, heavy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division plastered across their backs. They were heavily armed, completely unsmiling, and moving with the devastating speed of an apex predator that had finally cornered its prey. The lead agent stepped directly into the center aisle, holding a massive stack of federal warrants. His voice completely shattered the stunned silence of the room, booming with absolute undeniable authority. He screamed for every single person to remain exactly where they were, to take their hands out of their pockets, and to place their cellular phones face down on the tables immediately. The transition from high society luxury to absolute panicked terror took less than 3 seconds. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Women in expensive evening gowns screamed and backed away from the tables, holding their hands in the air. Waiters dropped their silver trays, sending expensive crystal champagne flutes, shattering violently against the polished hardwood floor. The loud crashing sounds of breaking glass echoed like gunshots through the massive room. The elderly investors clutched their chests, looking around in complete bewildered horror, unable to process why armed federal law enforcement officers were swarming their glamorous celebration. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, completely insulated from the panic, watching my masterpiece unfold exactly as I had designed it. The federal agents did not hesitate. They systematically, rapidly secured the perimeter of the enormous ballroom, locking down every single exit and blocking the service hallways. A specialized cyber tactical team moved aggressively straight toward the expensive audiovisual setup near the stage. They forcefully pushed the hired technicians aside and immediately began ripping the power cords out of the presentation laptops. They seized every single digital device on the production tables, sealing them in heavy anti-static evidence bags to preserve the fraudulent data. I watched an agent physically confiscate a company tablet right out of the hands of the terrified event coordinator. The absolute swiftness of the asset seizure was breathtaking. On the stage, the beautiful, glittering illusion of Jessica completely shattered. The sleek wireless microphone slipped out of her manicured hand and plummeted to the floor, emitting a loud, painful screech of electronic feedback that made the crowd aggressively cover their ears. She stood frozen in the harsh white spotlight, her emerald silk gown suddenly looking like a ridiculous cheap costume. The smug, arrogant confidence that had defined her entire existence was entirely gone. Her face turned a sickly, horrifying shade of gray, and her mouth hung open in absolute wordless terror. She looked exactly like a small, terrified child who had finally been caught stealing. She scanned the chaotic room, desperately looking for Marcus to save her, to talk their way out of this, to spin another brilliant, flawless lie. But Marcus was not looking at her. From my concealed position near the back wall, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my charming, charismatic brother-in-law. The very second the heavy oak doors had crashed open, Marcus understood exactly what was happening. He did not freeze in shock, and he absolutely did not rush to the stage to protect his beloved wife. The moment he saw the yellow federal letters on the windbreakers, his survival instincts overrode his massive ego. He instantly abandoned the beautiful billionaire fantasy. He abandoned his investors. He abandoned my father. And he completely abandoned Jessica. I watched him drop his expensive crystal champagne glass directly onto the carpet. He kept his head down, avoiding the bright stage lights, and immediately began to slink backward, moving with incredible cowardly speed away from the center of the room. He used the panicked, swirling crowd as a human shield, aggressively pushing a terrified elderly woman out of his way to clear his path. He was heading straight for the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, a secondary exit that led directly to the freight elevators and the loading dock. He thought he was smarter than the federal government. He thought he could just slip out the back door, walk away from the massive burning wreckage, and disappear into the night with his hidden offshore millions. He made it exactly 2 steps past the swinging metal doors before the trap completely, violently slammed shut. A team of 4 heavy tactical agents had been stationed in the kitchen, specifically waiting for runners. The heavy metal doors swung open, and the sound of a violent, sudden physical struggle spilled out into the ballroom. There was a loud, heavy thud of a human body being forcefully thrown against a stainless steel industrial refrigerator. I heard Marcus yell out in shock and pain, his smooth, charismatic voice completely replaced by a panicked, guttural shout. He demanded to know what they were doing, loudly protesting that he was a respectable businessman and threatening to call his lawyers. The federal agents did not care about his tailored suit or his smooth, empty words. The swinging doors burst open again, and Marcus was aggressively dragged backward into the bright lights of the ballroom. His immaculate linen suit was completely, violently torn at the shoulder. His perfect confidence was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, struggling resistance of a cornered coward. 2 massive federal agents firmly pinned his arms behind his back, pushing him aggressively face first against the polished wood of a decorative structural column. The cold, sharp, mechanical click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the most beautiful, incredible sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Marcus was entirely immobilized, securely shackled, and roughly pulled to his feet. He looked across the room, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, his eyes darting frantically around the chaotic ballroom. His gaze swept over the terrified crowd, the shattered crystal, the seized computers, and the frozen form of his wife on the stage. And then finally, his frantic eyes found me standing quietly in the shadows at the back of the room. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply raised my glass of club soda, acknowledging his absolute total destruction. He stared at me, the devastating realization finally completely washing over him. He realized in that exact moment that the boring, narrow-minded corporate accountant had just completely outsmarted him, systematically dismantled his entire life, and permanently locked him in a federal cage. The raid was an absolute flawless execution, and the golden empire of Luminatech was officially dead. The heavy oak doors had barely swung shut behind Marcus before the lead investigator, Special Agent Miller, turned his absolute focus toward the stage. The chaotic murmurs of the terrified investors faded into a suffocating absolute silence as Miller took slow, deliberate steps up the velvet-lined stairs. He held a thick stack of official federal warrants in his right hand. Jessica was still standing exactly where she had dropped the microphone. Her emerald green silk gown, which had looked so regal and commanding just minutes earlier, now seemed like a ridiculous theatrical costume. She was trembling visibly, her flawless makeup catching the harsh glare of the stage lights. The entire ballroom watched in breathless horror as the federal agent approached the golden visionary of Luminatech. I stood completely still in the shadows at the back of the room, watching the very moment my sister's carefully constructed billionaire fantasy completely unraveled. She looked down at Agent Miller, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate panic. She tried to manufacture one of her famous charming smiles, but her facial muscles completely failed her. She was entirely trapped, and for the very first time in her pampered, incredibly privileged life, she could not simply bat her eyelashes and manipulate her way out of the consequences. Agent Miller did not lower his voice to spare her dignity. He projected his words with a deep, resonant authority, perfectly designed to carry across the massive silent ballroom. He stated her full legal name and explicitly informed her that she was the primary subject of a massive federal criminal investigation. He methodically listed the devastating charges one by one, letting each word land like a physical blow. Massive interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, systemic corporate embezzlement, severe tax evasion, and the deliberate targeted financial exploitation of vulnerable senior citizens. With every single terrifying charge that left the agent's mouth, Jessica physically shrank. The incredibly confident, brilliant tech founder persona she had effortlessly worn for the past year was completely entirely gone. It evaporated into the stale air of the ballroom, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, incredibly selfish amateur con artist who had finally been backed into a corner. I watched her perfectly manicured hands clutch the expensive fabric of her gown. She was desperately searching her mind for a way out, a loophole, a person to blame. She had always relied on Marcus to handle the heavy confrontations, but Marcus was already sitting in the back of a federal vehicle in handcuffs. She was completely, utterly alone on that grand stage. Jessica's frantic eyes darted across the sea of shocked faces below her. She looked at the elderly retired teachers and the widowed grandmothers who were currently clutching their chests in profound devastation, realizing their life savings were completely gone. She looked at the federal agents securing the exit doors, and then her desperate searching gaze fell upon our parents sitting in the very front row. My mother was standing up, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth in absolute sheer disbelief. But my father Thomas was simply staring up at the stage, his face a mask of complete, heartbreaking confusion. This was the man who had loved her unconditionally since the day she was born. This was the man who had taken a second mortgage out on his fully paid-off suburban home, who had completely liquidated his entire $800,000 retirement fund just to fund her delusions of grandeur. This was the man who had looked me directly in the eyes and threw me out of his house into the freezing rain because I dared to question her absolute brilliance. He looked up at his beautiful golden child, waiting for her to explain that this was all just a terrible, massive misunderstanding. Instead of protecting the man who had sacrificed literally everything for her, Jessica did exactly what a cornered predator always does. She completely dropped her golden child facade and lunged for the absolute easiest human shield available. Jessica burst into violent, hysterical, theatrical tears. She practically threw herself forward toward the edge of the stage, pointing a perfectly manicured, shaking finger directly down into the front row. She pointed straight at our father's chest. Her voice echoed through the massive ballroom, hitting a shrill, absolutely piercing frequency of pure, desperate panic. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she did not do this. She shrieked that she was completely innocent and that she was merely the creative marketing face of the company. She pointed at our father again, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, loudly declaring to the federal agents that Thomas was the official chief financial officer. She screamed that her dad controlled all of the corporate money, that he managed all the bank accounts, and that he was the one who had completely orchestrated the entire massive fraud. She sobbed violently, claiming that her own father had manipulated her youth and her trusting nature to steal millions of dollars from innocent people while hiding behind her visionary ideas. The sheer absolute monstrosity of the lie sent a shockwave of physical revulsion through the entire ballroom. The elderly investors, who had trusted my father deeply, who had played golf with him and invited him to their homes, stared at him with sudden dawning horror. They instantly believed her because Jessica was a flawless sociopathic actress. My mother let out a loud, agonizing gasp, completely paralyzed by the sight of her favorite beautiful child publicly and maliciously throwing her beloved husband directly into the jaws of the federal government. Jessica did not hesitate or stutter. She continued to absolutely weaponize her tears, begging Agent Miller to look at the official state corporate registry and the federal tax returns. She loudly sobbed that her father's signature was the only one on the legally binding documents, pushing the entire colossal weight of a 20-year federal prison sentence squarely onto the shoulders of the man who had given her his entire world. She was feeding him directly to the wolves without a single solitary ounce of remorse, simply to buy herself a few miserable seconds of perceived freedom. I watched my father from the deep shadows of the back wall, and I saw the exact devastating moment his entire universe permanently, violently shattered. The physical reaction was absolutely horrific to witness. Thomas did not yell. He did not try to defend himself against the vicious, hysterical accusations flying from the stage. The profound, catastrophic betrayal did not just break his heart, it completely destroyed his basic, fundamental understanding of reality. All the years of blinding favoritism, all the money he had blindly handed over, all the times he had viciously punished me just to elevate her, it all violently crashed down on him in one single agonizing second. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he had traded his loyal, honest daughter for a monster who was now actively trying to lock him in a federal penitentiary to save her own skin. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening, translucent gray. His knees physically buckled beneath his custom-tailored tuxedo. He could not even hold his own body weight. My father collapsed backward into his velvet chair, completely, utterly destroyed. His arms fell limply to his sides, and he stared blankly ahead, his mouth slightly open, his eyes entirely vacant. He looked completely hollowed out, like a man who had just watched his own soul be ripped from his chest and casually discarded on the floor. He did not care about the federal agents surrounding him or the angry, betrayed murmurs of his neighbors. He was a completely broken, ruined man, entirely crushed by the absolute monstrous reality of the golden child he had worshipped his entire life. Jessica stood on the stage, her arms still fully extended, pointing that trembling, manicured finger directly at the broken, hollowed-out shell of our father. Her desperate, hysterical sobs echoed through the massive crystal chandeliers, expecting the entire room to immediately rush to her defense. She had spent her entire 32 years of life successfully weaponizing her tears to manipulate every single situation in her favor. She genuinely believed that if she cried hard enough and screamed loud enough, the federal government would simply apologize for the inconvenience and arrest her innocent father instead. Agent Miller did not flinch. He did not offer her a sympathetic look or step forward to comfort her. He simply stood at the base of the stage, completely unfazed by the spectacular theatrical performance unfolding in front of him. He had spent his entire career dismantling sophisticated white-collar crime syndicates, and he knew a narcissistic con artist when he saw one. He reached inside his heavy, dark windbreaker and calmly pulled out a thick metal clipboard securing a stack of federal documents. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that you could hear the soft clinking of the melting ice sculptures dropping water onto the silver platters. Agent Miller looked up at Jessica, his expression completely devoid of any human warmth. He spoke in a voice that was perfectly measured, completely clinical, and absolutely devastating. He looked directly into her frantic, terrified eyes and told her to drop the act. He stated clearly for the entire dead silent room to hear that they already knew Thomas did not move a single solitary dime of the stolen investor funds. He tapped the thick stack of papers on his clipboard. He announced that the federal government possessed a complete undeniable forensic trace of every single offshore shell company and encrypted bank account that she and Marcus had personally opened in Nevada, Delaware, and the Cayman Islands. He explicitly mentioned the exact dates and the exact internet protocols, proving that Jessica herself had executed the fraudulent wire transfers from her own personal laptop. He completely dismantled her entire pathetic defense in less than 30 seconds, leaving her totally exposed under the harsh glaring stage lights. Jessica physically recoiled as if she had been violently struck. The color completely vanished from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost trapped inside a luxury emerald gown. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her, crushing her massive ego into microscopic pieces. She could not charm her way out. She could not lie her way out. She could not sacrifice her father to save herself. For the first time in her incredibly privileged, sheltered life, she was facing a concrete, unmovable consequence. When her voice finally returned, it was not the smooth, commanding tone of a visionary tech founder. It was the shrill, panicked shriek of a cornered criminal. She gripped the edge of the podium, her knuckles turning completely white. She screamed at Agent Miller, demanding to know exactly how the federal authorities got that specific financial information. She shrieked that her banking networks were heavily encrypted and completely, totally untraceable. She demanded to know who had illegally accessed her private servers, completely incriminating herself in front of a ballroom full of witnesses, just to satisfy her own arrogant, desperate need for control. Agent Miller did not answer her immediately. Instead, he slowly lowered his clipboard. He turned his head away from the stage and looked straight across the massive crowded ballroom. The sea of terrified investors and shocked high society guests instinctively parted, creating a clear, unobstructed line of sight. Agent Miller looked directly into the deep shadows at the very back of the room, where I was standing perfectly still holding my glass of club soda. His voice boomed across the silent, cavernous space, carrying the absolute ultimate finality of a judge delivering a sentence. He announced to the entire horrified room that the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not have to hack into any servers because the entire criminal enterprise was handed to them on a silver platter. He stated loudly and clearly that the White-Collar Crime Division had received a fully audited, comprehensive forensic dossier directly from a Ms. Rachel. He paused, letting my name echo off the vaulted ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. He looked back at Jessica and delivered the final crushing blow. He told her that my forensic audit was the most thorough, ruthless, and perfectly packaged unmasking of corporate wire fraud his division had seen all year. The reaction in the ballroom was absolutely instantaneous and entirely explosive. Hundreds of heads violently snapped backwards, searching the shadows to find the woman who had just single-handedly annihilated a multi-million-dollar syndicate. But the only reaction that truly mattered to me was the reaction of my family. My mother, who had been standing paralyzed in the front row, physically jolted as if she had touched a live electrical wire. She spun around her expensive designer dress, whipping around her ankles, her wide, terrified eyes desperately scanning the back of the room. When her gaze finally locked onto mine, standing quietly in my boring charcoal gray corporate suit, her jaw completely, literally dropped. The woman who had thrown me out of her house, who had called me a bitter, jealous failure, who had told me I was no longer her daughter, was now staring at the absolute, undisputed architect of her own total devastation. My father, who was still collapsed in his velvet chair, slowly turned his head. His eyes were red and completely hollowed out by Jessica's horrific betrayal. He looked at me across the massive distance of the ballroom, and for the very first time in my entire 28 years of life, I saw absolute total comprehension dawn on his face. He finally understood that the quiet, boring accountant he had always dismissed was the only person smart enough to uncover the truth and strong enough to save him from dying in a federal prison. I had secured his total immunity, but I had also forced him to finally see the absolute monstrous reality of the golden child he had worshipped. On the stage, Jessica was completely physically trembling. Her flawless engineered reality was entirely shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. She looked at me standing in the shadows and let out a sound of pure primal, helpless rage. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, and now I had systematically, ruthlessly removed the ground completely out from under her feet. Agent Miller did not give her another second to process her absolute destruction. He stepped up onto the stage, moving with swift, undeniable physical authority. He grabbed Jessica by the arm of her expensive emerald silk gown, spinning her around roughly to face the velvet curtains. He told her, in a voice devoid of any sympathy, to turn around and put her hands behind her back. I watched with absolute ice-cold satisfaction as the federal agent aggressively pulled her perfectly manicured hands together. The harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. The golden visionary of Lumina Tech, the billionaire genius who had stolen the life savings of innocent grandmothers, was officially nothing more than a common federal inmate. I took a slow, quiet sip of my club soda, the condensation cool and refreshing against my skin. I did not smile, and I did not flinch. I simply stood in the shadows and watched the absolute perfect execution of ultimate justice. The news of the Lumina Tech raid hit the local and national media networks before the sun even came up the very next morning. It was an absolutely spectacular, incredibly loud, and deeply public collapse. The brilliant visionary tech couple, who had proudly graced local magazine covers and hosted lavish catered marina parties, were now splashed across every single news channel wearing heavy federal handcuffs and standard-issue orange jumpsuits. The Federal White-Collar Crime Division moved with absolute devastating and terrifying efficiency. Armed with the incredibly detailed 400-page forensic dossier and the crystal-clear audio recording I had secretly provided, the federal prosecutors did not have to spend months building a speculative or circumstantial case. They had an absolute ironclad, completely unshakable foundation of pure, undeniable fact. The government immediately moved to freeze every single domestic and offshore bank account tied to the operation. They seized the million-dollar downtown penthouse, they impounded the luxury yacht sitting in the South Florida marina, and they permanently locked down every single liquid asset connected to my sister and her charming husband. For the first few desperate weeks in federal custody, Jessica and Marcus tried to fiercely maintain their arrogant delusion of untouchable superiority. They hired incredibly expensive, high-powered defense attorneys, using the very last hidden fragments of their offshore cash reserves, fully believing they could simply spin another beautiful, sophisticated lie and magically charm their way out of a massive federal indictment. But federal prosecutors absolutely do not care about superficial charm, and they certainly do not care about manufactured glamorous victimhood. When their expensive attorneys were finally forced to sit down in a cold, windowless federal interrogation room and listen to the high-definition audio recording of their own clients explicitly bragging about forging institutional documents and maliciously stealing from vulnerable elderly pensioners, the United Defensive Front completely violently shattered into a million pieces. The golden couple, the perfect visionary partners who had built an entire lucrative empire on mutual manipulation and shared greed, instantly turned on each other the very second real terrifying consequences appeared. It was absolutely pathetic and entirely predictable to witness. Marcus desperately tried to secure a favorable plea deal by aggressively claiming that Jessica was the true evil mastermind, arguing that she had personally forged all the corporate executive signatures and emotionally manipulated him into silent compliance. Jessica instantly retaliated with pure venomous hysteria, violently throwing Marcus directly under the heavy federal bus. She sobbed to the federal prosecutors, claiming that Marcus had physically and emotionally forced her to set up the complex offshore shell companies, and that she was merely a naive, frightened wife, deeply terrified of her powerful, financially abusive husband. They spent grueling months in federal custody, viciously tearing each other apart, fighting like cornered, desperate rats over pathetic scraps of reduced sentencing. But the forensic evidence I had meticulously compiled was simply too thorough and too perfectly documented. It clearly, irrefutably proved they were both equally, completely, legally guilty. In the end, they had absolutely no choice but to accept massive crushing plea deals to avoid a highly publicized, lengthy trial that would have absolutely guaranteed them even harsher maximum punishments. Marcus received a devastating sentence of 15 years, in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Jessica, the beautiful, perfect golden child who had spent her entire 32 years of life expecting the entire world to blindly bow at her feet, received 12 agonizing years. 12 years locked in a cold concrete federal cell, completely permanently stripped of her designer silk gowns, her stolen diamond necklaces, and her endless delusional vanity. But the absolute heaviest and most tragic toll of the entire corporate collapse did not fall on the two criminals currently sitting in federal prison. It fell entirely heavily on the two people who had blindly and unconditionally funded their beautiful, monstrous lie. My parents, Thomas and Linda, were completely financially annihilated. When the federal authorities legally seized the Luminatech assets, the entire precarious house of cards collapsed directly onto my father. Because my father had blindly and willingly taken out a massive, staggering second mortgage on his fully paid-off suburban home to fund Jessica's initial fraudulent venture, the banking institution swiftly and mercilessly foreclosed on the property. Furthermore, because he had willingly liquidated his entire $800,000 lifelong retirement fund and handed it directly to a fraudulent shell company, that money was completely, permanently, irrevocably gone. The federal government could absolutely not recover stolen funds that had already been recklessly spent on luxury living and expensive vintage champagne. My parents went from living a highly comfortable, stable, upper-middle-class existence to experiencing absolute, complete, terrifying poverty in a matter of a few short months. They lost the beautiful, sprawling house they had comfortably lived in for over 30 years. They lost their expensive country club memberships. They lost their life savings. They lost absolutely everything they had ever worked for, all because they chose to blindly worship a beautiful lie rather than respect the ugly truth. Exactly 6 months after the massive federal raid, I was sitting in my quiet, secure apartment, enjoying a simple, warm cup of morning coffee when the front security intercom buzzed loudly. I knew exactly who it was before I even looked at the video security monitor. I took a slow, deep breath, walked down to the main lobby, and found my parents standing awkwardly on the sidewalk in the freezing cold Seattle rain. They looked incredibly old and deeply broken. My father, Thomas, was severely stooped, his shoulders heavily slumped forward, wearing a faded thin jacket that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. My mother, Linda, looked entirely defeated, her face pale and heavily lined with deep, profound exhaustion. The arrogant smugness and aggressive condescension they had proudly worn at the expensive steakhouse dinner was completely, totally erased. They had been forcefully, legally evicted and forced to move into a tiny, cramped, rented apartment on the rough industrial outskirts of the city. And the crushing, devastating reality of their new impoverished situation had finally broken their lifelong delusion. My mother started crying the absolute second I pushed open the heavy glass lobby doors. She reached out toward me with shaking, trembling hands, desperately trying to grab my arm for physical and emotional support. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking with a raw, genuine, terrifying panic. She told me they were absolutely drowning in debt. She sobbed that they could barely afford to pay their basic monthly utility bills, and that my father was simply too old and too physically broken to ever go back to working a demanding full-time job. She violently begged for my forgiveness, crying hysterically that they had been terribly, maliciously manipulated by Jessica, and that they simply did not know what they were doing when they threw me out. My father stood silently beside her, staring down at the wet concrete pavement while tears silently slid down his weathered, deeply lined face. He finally looked up at me with an expression of pure, absolute, utter desperation and asked if I could please just help them financially survive. He said he knew I had a good, stable corporate accounting job, and he begged me to take them in to let them live in my spare guest room just until they could miraculously get back on their feet. I stood firmly on the wet sidewalk, letting the cold, biting rain fall completely around us. I looked at the man who had looked me dead in the eyes and viciously called me a bitter, jealous failure in front of his golden child. I looked at the woman who had happily, violently thrown me out of her house into a storm simply because I dared to warn them about the ruthless monster they had raised and nurtured. I did not feel a single solitary ounce of lingering anger. I did not feel the burning, acidic desire for revenge that had quietly consumed me for so many long, lonely years. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound, and deeply beautiful sense of absolute peace. I looked directly into my father's crying red eyes and my voice was perfectly, completely calm and steady. I told him clearly that I had already freely given him the absolute greatest gift he would ever receive in his entire life. I reminded him that I had spent 48 agonizing sleepless hours compiling a flawless massive federal dossier specifically designed to secure his absolute legal immunity. I told him bluntly that if I had not personally intervened, he would currently be sitting rotting in a federal prison cell facing 20 mandatory years for massive corporate wire fraud and elder abuse. I had successfully saved his physical freedom. I had literally saved his entire life. But I firmly and clearly told him that I was absolutely not responsible for saving him from the devastating financial consequences of his own disastrous, arrogant choices. I explained that they had deliberately chosen to blindly invest their entire financial future into a toxic, manipulative lie, simply because it wonderfully stroked their own massive parental egos. They had willingly chosen to emotionally and physically discard their loyal, honest, hardworking daughter in order to aggressively elevate a charismatic criminal. I told them they were entirely free to live the rest of their natural lives out of a federal prison cell. But they would absolutely have to live it without my hard-earned money, without my emotional sympathy, and completely without my presence. My mother let out a loud, agonizing, piercing wail, begging me frantically not to abandon them in their darkest hour of need. But I had already successfully abandoned the desperate toxic need for their parental approval a very long time ago. I turned around, walked calmly back inside my secure modern building, and let the heavy glass doors close firmly and decisively behind me, hearing the absolute beautiful sound of the magnetic locks engaging. I walked back up to my quiet, safe, beautiful apartment, and I breathed in the absolute glorious, intoxicating feeling of total, pure freedom. I had finally permanently severed the heavy, toxic emotional chains of my broken family forever. I am sharing this deeply personal, incredibly painful journey with all of you today because I know for an absolute fact that there is someone out there listening to this exact story right now who is hopelessly trapped in the exact same toxic family dynamic. You are the invisible child, the highly responsible sibling, the permanently designated family scapegoat who is constantly unfairly asked to sacrifice your own peace of mind, just to magically maintain the comfortable, fragile illusions of the very people who are actively supposed to protect you. You are completely physically and emotionally exhausted from constantly pouring your beautiful heart and your limited resources into a deep, endless black void, desperately hoping that one day they will finally turn around and truly, genuinely see your actual value. If you take absolutely anything away from my deeply painful story, let it be this: one undeniable universal truth. Being legally classified as family does not give anyone a free universal pass to continuously exploit your deep loyalty, to drain your hard-earned finances, or to absolutely destroy your emotional well-being. Setting firm, clear boundaries is not cruel, and it is certainly not an act of dramatic, selfish revenge. Setting boundaries is an act of pure, necessary, profound survival. Love is absolutely not supposed to be a one-way manipulative transactional street where your vital needs are constantly aggressively pushed aside, simply to accommodate someone else's massive fragile ego. If the people who are inherently supposed to love and fiercely protect you continually choose their own easy comfort and their own glittering toxic delusions over the absolute hard truth, it is entirely perfectly deeply okay for you to finally walk away. It is incredibly okay to stop desperately trying to save people who are actively, happily destroying themselves and trying to pull you down with them. You absolutely have to let them face the brutal, unvarnished, devastating consequences of their own toxic, arrogant actions. You have the ultimate, fundamental right to fiercely protect your peace, to build your own safe, beautiful, chosen life, and to completely happily leave the heavy, suffocating, miserable baggage of a broken family far, far behind you. You absolutely deserve to be surrounded by incredible people who genuinely respect your honesty and your truth, not toxic people who constantly aggressively demand your silence. Thank you so incredibly much for staying with me through this incredibly difficult, deeply emotional story. It takes a massive, tremendous amount of courage to truly face these kinds of painful family truths, and I am deeply, deeply grateful that you allowed me to share my personal journey with you today. If this story truly deeply resonated with your own life experiences, if you have ever successfully had to bravely walk away from toxic, abusive family dynamics just to finally save yourself. Please hit that like button right now and absolutely subscribe to the channel for more powerful content exactly like this. I would also absolutely love to connect with you directly and hear your stories. So please drop a comment down below, letting me know exactly what city, state, or country you are watching from today and what exact time it is right now where you are. Your continuous support means the absolute world to me, and it truly helps these vital, important survivor stories reach the brave people who genuinely, desperately need to hear them today. Please always remember that you are constantly worthy of deep respect, and you always absolutely possess the ultimate incredible power to completely rewrite your own beautiful ending.